No pain, no gain. Or pain is just weakness leaving the body. We're sure you heard these sayings before. After all, you'll find them on gym posters across the world, motivating gym goers and promoting pain in every single gym session. Everyone knows that pain is an essential part of muscle building, so we need to learn how to deal with it and keep on pushing. Or should we? The correlation between pain and progress has been crafted so magnificently that we're led to believe you can't have one without the other. But is this way of thinking causing more harm than good? New research says, probably. Let's explore the reason for muscle soreness, how to deal with it, and we'll give you a few tips. And more importantly, if sore muscles mean you should take a rest day or if you should keep training through the pain. If you've ever felt high levels of soreness after training, rest assured that's not just you. In fact, everyone who has ever trained has felt that pain to some extent. In fact, muscle soreness after physical training is a clinically recognized phenomenon known as delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS for short. The delayed onset part refers to the fact that your muscles don't feel sore immediately. In fact, you might even feel good after a hard workout. However, as time goes by, the soreness usually sets in. Usually it takes at least 12 hours for DOMS to set in, peaking after 24 hours. Still, it seems that the worst of it comes in the morning after you wake up. Ouch! As soon as you open your eyes in the morning and try to get up, your body hurts at the slightest movement. Sometimes it's difficult just to move your limbs and simply get out of bed, and you're just starting your day. Regardless of when the pain sets in or how long it lasts, everyone who has ever lifted or played sports has experienced it before. And in truth, it's an inevitable part of lifting that is going to occur. The real question is, how bad will the discomfort get? And will it last just a few days or a whole week? This time period of soreness can leave us in a predicament. Should we push through the pain and persevere, or should we take the day off? Motivational posters have us believe that we definitely need to keep on training because rest days are for the weak. However, something in your head is telling you that's not right. Still, you definitely don't want to seem weak or lazy to your friends. Therefore, what's the right move for a sore lifter? To answer this question, let's go back to the beginning, that part about pain. Why do we even feel pain after training? And why is it so bad sometimes that climbing up a flight of stairs feels impossible? You thought that training makes you stronger, not weaker. Well, the good thing about DOMS being so common is that it's been a highly studied topic in sports research. As a result, we know quite a bit, but we also have a lot to learn. While we have a general idea of what causes DOMS and how to help mitigate its occurrence, we aren't sure of the exact mechanisms, why it occurs, and what variables affect its intensity. For example, an early theory stated that DOMS could act as a safety measure for you to reduce injury to a stressed muscle. It suggested that it was a response meant to stop you from using a muscle as intensely, thus preventing further injury. To be clear, we're not saying this was why we experienced DOMS. We're merely showing you how researchers are still looking for answers and the theories they offer. While it's an interesting take, it doesn't hold up when we start to consider all the variations and variables, such as different people suffering from different levels of pain in different parts of the body, and so on. A more plausible theory, which is generally accepted today, is called the muscle damage theory. This theory is exactly what it sounds like. During weight training, muscle damage occurs, resulting in microscopic tears in the connective tissue. This damage results in inflammation that can stimulate nociceptors. These are sensory neurons that respond to damaging stimuli. In other words, it causes pain. Still, now there's a newer theory. Rather than DOMS being caused by muscle damage, it's believed to come from neural microdamage. See, we simply aren't aware of the exact mechanisms. However, while we aren't sure of the exact mechanisms that cause DOMS, we do know what triggers it: the eccentric contraction of muscles. Studies show us that DOMS-inducing stress on a muscle primarily occurs during eccentric contraction. The eccentric contraction of a muscle occurs when the muscle fibers lengthen. It can be thought as the going down phase of an exercise, such as lowering a dumbbell during a bicep curl or allowing a barbell to come down to the chest on a bench press. If you believe DOMS is caused by muscle damage, this occurs as more muscle damage occurs during the eccentric contraction of muscles. If you believe that DOMS is caused by neural damage, this occurs when the muscle is super stretched during the eccentric contraction, as it traps uncompressible fluid and causes micro-injury to the nerve terminals. In either theory, eccentric contractions are the culprit. Still, a problem that remains is the relationship between muscle damage and pain has been found to not be as strong as once thought. We'll get to that a little bit later. But first, we want to answer an important question. Is there any benefit to DOMS? Does waking up feeling fresh mean we didn't have a good workout? Is DOMS related to progress? Let's settle this now. The short answer is no. You do not need to feel sore to have a good workout. In the past, DOMS was thought to be an indicator of a good workout, which resulted in significant muscle growth. However, by looking at modern studies on the matter, there seems to be no evidence that shows a correlation between DOMS and the level of muscle hypertrophy that occurs. Our flaws in thinking were born out of errors in our understanding of both hypertrophy and DOMS. During this time, we believed that a primary driver of muscle growth was muscle damage. Therefore, as DOMS is caused by muscle damage, it seems that it would then be related to muscle growth. More DOMS means more muscle damage, which means more muscle growth. The line of reasoning makes sense. Well, it made sense. We now know it isn't true. For one, as we mentioned earlier, there's a weak relationship between the intensity of DOMS and muscle damage. For example, we can look at a study that's actually titled "Delayed Onset Muscle Soreness Does Not Reflect the Magnitude of Eccentric Exercise-Induced Muscle Damage." The title literally says it all. The study had students perform either 12, 24, or 60 eccentric muscle actions with the elbow flexors. The students then used a visual graph with a range from -50 to +50 to indicate their level of soreness. They did so while the elbow was in 3 different positions. All in all, the results were basically all over the place with no clear pattern. The researchers determined that there was a poor correlation between DOMS and eccentric contractions. Still, we have studies that look at MRI pictures of varying levels of muscle damage and their relation to DOMS. But again, there seems to be no relation between the two. For example, the markers of muscle damage in individuals differed from one another during their time course. In addition, these markers for muscle damage didn't match up with the time course of muscle soreness. In other words, you could experience no DOMS even though you had significant muscle damage, while experiencing significant levels of DOMS with minimal muscle damage. Another incorrect assumption made is that muscle damage is the main driver of muscle growth. While muscle damage may play a role, we now believe that mechanical tension is the primary driving force for muscle growth. Well, that's what we currently believe. Perhaps we'll find contradicting evidence as research in the field evolves. Regardless, the point is that muscle growth can occur without muscle damage. All in all, this leaves us with 2 facts. The levels of DOMS has little to no correlation with muscle damage, and even if it did, muscle damage is not the primary driver of muscle growth. Therefore, it's safe to say your level of DOMS does not indicate the amount your muscles will grow. We should also acknowledge the fact that DOMS is not consistent between individuals themselves or across different individuals. If DOMS was an indicator of muscle growth, we would expect it to have some consistency. However, current research shows that it doesn't. For example, research has shown a great deal of variability within individuals. Some people report high levels of DOMS after every workout, while others rarely ever report DOMS. In addition, you have probably noticed that some muscles are more prone to DOMS, such as the biceps or any type of leg muscle. At the same time, in the majority of people, the intensity of DOMS begins to subside the longer you train. With this in mind, consider that later workouts are usually performed with higher intensity and higher loads, yet DOMS is attenuated. Another piece of anecdotal evidence that suggests DOMS is not associated with muscle growth is that DOMS do not only occur after resistance training. Long-distance runners, such as marathoners, regularly report moderate to severe muscle soreness the day after a big race. We also know that long-distance running is an aerobic sport and is not associated with muscle hypertrophy in the same manner that resistance training is. Therefore, we seem to get a high level of DOMS even with minimal, if any, muscle growth. So far, it seems that no, we do not need DOMS for muscle growth. There is little and likely zero correlation between the two. We believe this is very important to understand so that you stop chasing DOMS in your workout. In addition, don't judge the effectiveness of your workout by the level of DOMS you have. Now that we can put that myth behind us, we should answer a question we asked earlier. Can we train with sore muscles? And what do we mean by sore? Before we can answer this question, we need to realize there are different levels of sore or even pain. This spectrum is of course relative, but most people can tell the difference. If your muscles are painful to the touch or you feel pain when you move them, you definitely went way overboard with your training and will likely need a good week or so for your muscles to fully recover. Keep in mind that your muscles should never be so sore that it's painful, as it normally means you caused way too much damage to them, which can actually be a detriment to muscle growth. Still, even if one of your muscles is sore, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't work out at all. It just means you can't work out that muscle. For example, if your legs are sore, you can easily train your back, chest, shoulders, or arms. In fact, this should be the norm, as you should be following a professionally designed program that's using an appropriate training split. A training split refers to a training program that splits training days by body part, such as chest day, back day, upper day, etc. It may also separate muscle groups by function, such as pulling day or pushing day. If you follow any well-designed split, there will be a minimum 48 hours between training the same muscle. However, this could go up to as much as 6 days, such as following a bro split, where you give each muscle its own training day once a week. As research suggests that training a muscle twice a week is optimal, you would have 72 to 96 hours between a muscle group. Doing so heavily mitigates the need to worry about training a muscle if it's sore, as there will be ample time for the soreness to subside and the muscle to fully recover. Now let's talk about actually working out a muscle while it's sore. Yay or nay? If a muscle is still sore to any degree, it's a sign that it's under-recovered. Therefore, training it again is probably not going to do you much good. Let's set aside the fact that you might simply just add more damage to the muscle or may just cause more pain. When a muscle is under-recovered, it's unable to perform to the same level as a fully recovered muscle. For one, the pain can impede a lifter's movement pattern in order to avoid pain. As you likely know, the movement of a lift can not only ensure optimal muscle activation, but also prevent chances of injury. If the correct movement pattern of an exercise is difficult to perform due to pain, a lifter will be tempted to alter their movement pattern. Doing so will disrupt proper muscle activation. Further, in order to produce the same amount of force, an unaffected muscle will be recruited to compensate for loss in force of the affected muscle. This could have two possible outcomes, neither good. The first is that the unintended muscle will experience hyperactivity. Basically, you're causing it to continually fire when it should be relaxing. For one, this can result in overuse injuries. Secondly, if it happens a lot, it can result in the second outcome, a disrupted muscle ratio. In the body, most muscles are paired with another muscle, which work against each other. These are called antagonist and agonist. Examples are the biceps and triceps, or quadriceps and hamstrings. For these to work optimally, they should have specific strength ratios so that one doesn't overpower the other. However, when one is continually fired, it can grow stronger, disrupting the proper ratio and again increasing chances for injury. In addition, the alteration in the movement pattern will place unaccustomed stress on the muscle ligaments and tendons, which may also increase the chance of injury. For example, flaring your elbows on the bench press. Now let's say the lifter can brave the pain and perform the proper movement. There's still likely going to be a problem. An increase in soreness of a muscle is usually accompanied with a decrease in performance. This drop in performance can show a diminished range of motion, decreased force production, and/or a decrease in strength. In fact, if severe DOMS is present, it can take up to 8 to 10 days for strength levels to return to normal. Peak torque will also see a drop with DOMS. A study looked at the result of repeatedly contracting the biceps muscle. Force was then measured over the following days to measure the effect. Indeed, a drop in force was measured. At 0 hours, a drop of 43.5% was present. At 24 hours, a drop of 38.8% was present. At 48 hours, a significant drop of 32% was still present. This phenomenon tells us two things. First is that you shouldn't train a muscle if it's experiencing significant levels of soreness. It also provides more evidence as to why you shouldn't be chasing pain in the gym. Why chase pain if it'll diminish performance for the entire week? Chase gains, not pain. One thing to consider is the analgesic effect of light resistance training. Light aerobic exercise has consistently been found to have a significant analgesic effect on varying pain levels, including chronic pain. Lately, research has also been looking at resistance training to reduce pain with positive results. This includes patients who are recovering from breast cancer. Still, there's been specific research on the analgesic effect of light resistance training on relieving soreness of DOMS. In short, it does, and significantly so. For example, in one particular study, 14 subjects performed maximal eccentric contractions on the elbow flexors, which includes your biceps, to create soreness from DOMS. In the following weeks after, they performed light eccentric exercise on one arm, while the other used maximal eccentric exercise. While the maximum exercise arm saw 0 improvement in soreness in the following days, the light exercise arm saw a significant decrease in soreness of 40% and a 40% decrease in tenderness. In addition, their range of motion saw a greater increase of 5%. While you may not want to train a muscle with normal levels of intensity, there's still some benefits of training the muscle with low intensity. Now that we understand DOMS a little more, which includes understanding that we don't understand everything, how do we deal with it? Well, as mentioned at the beginning of this video, DOMS is of the greatest concern under two conditions. The time at which you're most susceptible to DOMS is when you first start training. This can also include times of going on prolonged hiatus. The stress and stimuli from training your muscle is a novel experience, and your body is not yet adapted to it, nor the recovery process. The second time at which you'll be highly susceptible to DOMS is when you begin a new movement pattern. Even when you've been training for some time, performing a brand new movement can sometimes be a stressful enough stimulus that it'll have a similar effect as when you first started. Therefore, the best way to mitigate the effect of DOMS is to start light and slowly increase the intensity. Upon first starting your training or performing a new movement, the novelty of the stimuli is enough to have a positive effect without needing to use high intensity. Therefore, ease into it. For your first week of training or when starting a new program, you should stay away from failure. In addition, stay away from heavier loads. Instead of having the goal of seeing how much work you can do, have a goal of training while avoiding DOMS. Take the time to learn the correct movement pattern rather than seeing how much you can lift. For example, let's say you're doing squats on your first day. Use a weight that you can do for 15 to 20 reps and only do 8 to 10. Heck, maybe even just use body weight. This is a light load, and it stays away from failure. However, you'll still take the body through the movement pattern, which will still start training the neuromuscular system. This will be adequate work for your first week. The same idea goes with learning a new movement. Use a light load and simply practice the movement pattern. From here, slowly begin to increase your intensity. Do this by increasing the weight and bringing your sets closer to failure. Another practice you should follow wherever you are in your training program is to follow a professionally constructed workout plan. This will include a training split that separates training a muscle by a few days. Again, sports researchers believe you should train a muscle twice a week. For example, you might train your legs every Tuesday and Friday. That would provide a total of 72 and 96 hours between training sessions. Assuming you didn't go way overboard with your training, this is ample time to provide a muscle group with rest for any soreness to subside. This is especially true once you've been lifting for a while. Some other nutritional hacks include being sure to consume ample amounts of protein. Research has shown that protein works by improving your body's capability to repair muscle. Specifically, some research suggests protein intake can increase the rate of force and power restoration at 48 hours during the DOMS period. Caffeine intake is yet another heavily researched compound that shows positive effects on reducing muscle soreness from DOMS. Interestingly enough, that seems to specifically be from DOMS caused by resistance training as opposed to something like running. And again, staying active can have a significant effect on discomfort from DOMS. Even performing light aerobic exercise, such as going for a walk, can give you some relief, at least for a little bit. It's hard to give an exact time frame as to when DOMS stops becoming a major issue. However, once you've trained for a few months, the intensity of DOMS should be significantly less, if it's present at all. While you may be able to mitigate the effects of DOMS, you likely will experience it on some level. It's not a fun part of training, but it is just that, a part of training. As you know it's coming, prep your body and your training program. If you do, there's no reason you'll ever need to ask if you can train with sore muscles, as it'll be a non-issue. Dan had just gotten to the gym and was ready to meet his workout buddy Brian for their workout session. It was Dan's favorite workout day, Monday, also known as chest day. Him and Brian were just finishing up a bench press program, and today they were going to see how much they improved. But there was something else Dan was excited about. Earlier that day, he was checking out the usual fitness blogs and channels and came across some information that really blew his mind. Something that went against what he thought he knew and couldn't wait to share it with Brian. After they met and had some small chit-chat, Dan got right to it and asked Brian if he had seen any of the recent studies that showed how you could actually turn belly fat into abs. As he was expecting, his question was met with a chuckle from Brian. Brian had obviously thought this question was a bit silly, and it wasn't the first time he had heard it. However, this is usually something beginners will ask, but Brian thought Dan knew better. Didn't he know that you can either build muscle or burn fat, but you can't do them at the same time? Even Dan was suspicious at first, as he did not think you could either. Therefore, he needed to spend quite some time going over the studies to be sure of what they said. But it wasn't just one study. Dan had seen a few studies that showed it was possible. So, like any good lifting buddy, he began to share what he knew with Brian. Still, Brian wasn't convinced. He had personally looked into this before and was sure you couldn't. The only way this was going to be solved was through a good old-fashioned friendly bet. What was on the line? Well, if Brian won the debate and showed you couldn't transform belly fat into abs, He opted for a new tub of protein as he had just run out. Now, if Dan won and showed that you could, he wanted Brian to try his new transformation workout. So they both shook on it and it was a deal. And that's how this bet started. Can you transform belly fat into abs? Who's right? We're rooting for Dan, but we know it's an uphill battle to prove, as this has been a highly debated topic for some time in the fitness world. If we were to interview everyone who has ever worked out, transforming a beer belly into a washboard stomach would probably be the #1 goal mentioned. It's the perfect outcome. You're getting rid of what no one wants while gaining what everyone wants. So why doesn't everyone just do it? That's an easy question. Because it's hard to do. In fact, it's so hard that most people say it can't be done. But can you? Now that's not such an easy question to answer, hence the bet we have going on. What makes this particular question a little bit difficult to prove is that as of to date, there is no single study that specifically looks at burning fat and gaining muscle, specifically in the abdominal region. Therefore, in order to win this bet, Dan is going to need to take information from different studies and put them together to make the best conclusion he can. Still, what makes this issue increasingly complicated is that it isn't just a singular issue. It's actually a few different issues rolled into one. So first up, we need to clarify what is exactly meant when we say belly fat transforms into abs. Some may take this to mean that your fat literally transforms into muscle. This is not the case. Fat and muscle are two kinds of distinct tissue. Muscle connects to our skeletal system and is used to move our bodies and provide support. Stored fat is held to keep the body warm and protect the body. It's also used as a source of energy. More importantly, they function on completely different physiological systems and functions. Therefore, the growth of muscle and burning of fat occur independently of each other. So what people mean when they say that you can transform belly fat into abs, they are saying you are able to lose fat in your stomach area while also building ab muscles. Even with this clarification, Brian still insisted that you can't. Now, his belief isn't that surprising, nor is it completely misguided. In fact, this is the general consensus of a large majority of people. The primary argument is that losing fat is a catabolic process. Tissue is breaking down. For this to occur, you must expend more calories than you consume. This puts you into a caloric deficit, and your body will need to break down fatty tissue to access more energy. On the other hand, building muscle is anabolic. Tissue is being built up. For this to occur, it has been believed it required a caloric surplus to supply energy for the building process. This occurs when one consumes more calories than they use. However, this is a very basic explanation of our metabolic systems and how they function. To start the debate, Brian pulled out a study from 2019 that examined the best practices for bodybuilders during the off-season. He noted that the study clearly states that a positive energy balance is ideal for muscle growth and that a caloric surplus of 10 to 20% is ideal. As it was so clearly stated, Brian was thinking this was an easy win. This means that if your maintenance caloric intake is 3,000 calories a day, you would want to eat 3,300 to 3,600 calories per day. This amount of calories provides the extra energy required to fuel the process involved when building tissue. But Dan stood in agreement with this. He wasn't arguing that eating more calories is bad for muscle growth. Quite the opposite. Dan would still believe that being a caloric surplus would likely be easier to grow more muscle. In the past, when someone was looking to gain muscle and lose fat, they would do this by cycling between a caloric surplus and a caloric deficit, or bulking and cutting. They would eat a caloric surplus for 2 to 4 months to gain muscle, but would also put on a little extra fat. Therefore, they would then follow a cutting diet for 2 to 4 months to burn off extra fat. But now, Dan thinks that you could get away from the endless cycles of cutting and bulking and do them both at the same time. The point being, this did not interfere with Dan's primary claim. Actually, Dan was glad Brian had just used that study, as it referenced another very interesting study from 2013 that will help prove his point. Dan went on to explain that in this study, 2 groups of athletes followed one of 2 diets. The first had the group eat ad libitum. This means that the group ate as much food as they felt they needed and did not follow any sort of diet, nor did they count their calories. The other group received nutritional counseling. As the researchers wanted them in a 500 caloric surplus, they followed a specific diet that brought them to this number. Both groups then followed a resistance training program for 6 weeks. Now here's where things get interesting. You see, the surplus group did gain a greater amount of total body weight, 5.94 pounds. When Brian heard they gained almost 6 pounds, he initially thought this was a good thing. He would be wrong. Dan needed to break down these numbers in more detail to make more sense of them. You see, the surplus group did gain 5.94 pounds of body weight. However, this doesn't mean it was all muscle. Rather, they gained 3.74 pounds of muscle and 2.2 pounds of fat. So what about the other group? Brian asked. What happened with the other group is interesting. Initially, since the surplus group was eating a significantly greater amount of calories, the researchers expected them to have better muscle growth than the ad libitum group. And at the end of the day, they did, but not by much. You see, the ad libitum group gained 2.64 pounds of total body weight. Brian again incorrectly assumed what this meant. This is why it's important to look at research with a little more detail. They had gained 2.64 pounds of body weight, which included 2.64 pounds of muscle mass. Thinking about that for a second, Brian finally got it. If they gained 2.64 pounds of body weight, which included 2.64 pounds of muscle mass, that means they didn't gain any body fat. Another interesting component is that during the study, the ad libitum actually started eating a smaller amount of calories than normal. In total, the surplus group was eating 600 more calories a day. However, this only resulted in a little bit more muscle and a lot more fat. On the other hand, the ad libitum group was able to gain muscle without gaining any fat. What this demonstrates is that our understanding of calories and muscle mass is not as precise as we once thought. In other words, eating an extra 600 calories will not result in 600 calories worth of muscle. While the extra 600 calories resulted in a little bit more muscle mass, it resulted in 2.2 pounds of fat. This isn't going to help transform fat to muscle and will actually require more time, as you will then need to spend time losing this extra fat. While we used to think this was necessary, it now seems that perhaps we don't need all of the extra calories to build ab muscles after all. Maybe we have just been saying you need to eat a surplus because that's the easier thing to do. And maybe we don't fully understand metabolism and energy production as much as we think we did. Feeling a bit defeated, Brian then pointed out that while the study brings into question the need to be in a large surplus to gain muscle, there's one problem. Neither of the groups had simultaneously lost fat mass and gained muscle mass. As of now, it's simply been one or the other or both. So Brian demanded that both need to happen. He wanted to see proof that you can successfully burn off the belly and build the abs at the same time. Dan was ready for this and had a few studies to help his point. First, he was going to use a study from 2002. It seems we've known this was possible for a long time, actually. In this study, 20 healthy men were divided into two groups. 12 of them were placed in an experimental group where their carbohydrate intake was adjusted. Normally, their carbohydrate intake made up 48% of the calories in their diet. During the study for 6 weeks, this dropped to just 8% of their total calories, equaling about 50 grams per day. Now, very low-carb diets have long been known to have a great effect on maintaining muscle while in a caloric deficit. However, could they also help with building muscle? They would soon find out. So, the other 8 men continued their normal diet and both groups were told to follow their normal training. After 6 weeks, the low-carbohydrate group dropped 7.48 pounds of fat mass and gained 2.42 pounds of muscle mass. This was the first time that Brian had heard of something like this and was intrigued. Interestingly, the researchers were also pretty surprised and assumed it had something to do with the effect that a low-carb diet had on hormones. However, Dan noticed another vital component of their diet. In fact, this component seems to be the secret weapon to building muscle and burning fat. It's protein. You must have high protein to lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. This is what happened in this study. When the group lowered the amount of carbs they ate, not only did their fat intake increase, their protein intake doubled as well. Eating large amounts of protein has been found to provide several benefits in more than just one study researching successful body recomposition. For one, protein will keep you feeling full longer. While this won't necessarily help you build muscle, it can help you stay on track with your diet. Another interesting benefit researchers have known is that high protein helps to mitigate the possibility of any muscle breakdown. So if it can prevent muscle breakdown, could eating more even help build muscle? But that's not all. Researchers know of one other interesting benefit to protein that they think plays a role. It's something called TEF, or thermal effect of food. TEF is the amount of energy required to consume a food, digest it, absorb the nutrients, and discard it. As protein takes longer to break down, it will obviously require more energy to digest. This results in a significantly higher TEF compared to eating fats and carbs, 20 to 30%. This means you burn 20 to 30% of the calories you eat from protein just to digest it. You can eat a larger amount of protein but still burn more calories. Interesting. In fact, this has been shown to occur in several studies. Dr. Jose Antonio, the president of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, performed a really cool study using 4.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight or 2 grams per pound of body weight. This is about twice as much as what a traditional high-protein diet is. In it, he had one group of athletes consume this very high amount of protein while following their normal training program. There was also a control group that followed their same diet as usual. The high-protein group ate a diet that put them in an 800 caloric surplus. However, they had no changes in their body composition. This means they gained no extra fat during the study. It also means they didn't gain any muscle, Brian chimed in. This is true, but there's a good reason, and it's an important part of the problem. Up until now, they hadn't even discussed a key part of the equation. They had only been looking at the ability to lose fat and gain muscle merely by using nutrition. Then, as if on cue, Brian chimed in with the classic, "That's because abs are made in the kitchen." It was perfect timing. This acted as the perfect segue for Dan to bring up this next essential point. You've probably heard that phrase, "abs are made in the kitchen," quite a bit if you've been in the fitness world for any length of time. Unfortunately, just because it's repeated quite a lot doesn't make it true. The main gist of the meme is that it takes dedication with your diet in order to be able to see your abs. Nothing wrong with that. However, there seems to be a belief that everyone has a set of killer abs, but it's just covered up by fat. Therefore, all you must do is lose your belly fat and you'll eventually uncover them. No, you won't! Why? Because there's nothing to uncover. Well, you do have abs to an extent, as they're an essential muscle of the human body. However, unless you train them, they are relatively small. This can be said about any of your muscles. This is because your abs respond to training just like any other muscle. Would you expect to lose fat on your arms, then all of a sudden wake up with massive biceps? Of course not. What this tells us is that no, abs are not made in the kitchen, they're made in the gym. Therefore, if you're going to successfully transform your fat into abs, you must follow an effective ab workout program along with your diet. This is likely why there was no change in body composition. Adjusting your protein and carb intake is not enough to grow muscle. The only thing that builds muscle is following a proper training program. In fact, Dr. Antonio performed another study using 3.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, or 1.54 grams per pound of body weight. However, in this new study, he did not let the athletes train as they wanted. Rather, he placed them all on a proper training program that utilized progressive overload. This went on for 8 weeks. The high-protein group saw an increase in muscle mass and a decrease in fat mass. Dr. Antonio also refers to numerous other studies similar in nature, yet they did not see the significant increase in muscle mass. While he uses different words to explain this, it comes down to the fact that abs or any other muscle are not made in the kitchen. Your abdominal muscles are like any other muscle and need to be trained with progressive overload for that to happen. Brian stood a little perplexed. He had never heard any of this information, but now he could start putting it together and could start to see a path from belly fat to a six-pack. But there was one more part bugging him. That was the issue with spot reduction. Sure, you could maybe be able to grow your ab muscles, but how can you specifically burn the fat from your waist? Spot reduction was another belief that has been considered a myth by many for too long, but Dan knew this and was prepared. First of all, if you are looking for healthy weight loss, it shouldn't matter if you lose your belly fat first or not. As long as you are committed to achieving a healthy body fat percentage, you're going to lose belly fat sooner or later. However, while spot reduction is still largely disputed, there are several studies that show it can be possible. In fact, if there's any place on the body that could be effective, it would be the stomach. No way! This is one of the biggest myths there is, Brian Subkakalin said. Little did he know that Dan actually had 2 studies that suggest otherwise. Both of these studies suggest that in order to see spot reduction at the waist, you would need to get away from only doing strength workouts, such as performing 3 sets of 10 reps of crunches. If you want to decrease stomach fat, you must work your ab muscles with an endurance type of workout. For example, using circuit-style training or alternating between actual aerobic training and ab exercises. This can help increase blood flow to the surrounding muscles, which makes the breakdown of fat easier. Further, since you're training endurance, it can deplete the muscle glycogen of the surrounding muscle, which may encourage the breakdown of nearby fat for fuel. Both studies found this technique effective at increasing the amount of fat burned around the stomach. It seemed as though Dan was able to answer every question brought forth by Brian. Without having anywhere else to go, Brian challenged Dan to lay out what he would do if he wanted to transform belly fat into abs. Dan laid out 3 steps. Step 1 would be to get into a slight caloric deficit. We saw some studies where people were able to eat 800 surplus calories and didn't gain fat. However, they didn't lose fat either. As of now, it seems as though you need to be in a caloric deficit to burn fat. However, as we saw, individuals were still able to build muscle when they were in a slight deficit. As of now, we still don't know the exact mechanisms of what makes this possible, but we know it can work. Therefore, get into a slight caloric deficit of about 200 calories per day. Part 2, you will need to increase your protein intake. This seems to be the key to losing fat and gaining muscle simultaneously. The minimum should be 1 gram per pound of body weight, but upwards to 1.4 grams may provide even better results. And Part 3, you will need to use a proper training program to increase the muscle mass of your abdominal muscles. This does not mean you haphazardly perform some sit-ups and planks. No, you need to start training your abs like you would any other muscle. Hit them from different angles, track your progress, and use progressive overload. Progressive overload is the lifting principle that states, in order to see consistent improvement, you must consistently place a greater demand on the body. This can be done by adding weight or adding reps. At the same time, alternate between 2 types of ab training: a strength session to focus on building ab muscles and an aerobic fashion to try and maximize the fat loss around the belly. So, do you have a specific ab program you would use? Brian asked. Oh, so does that mean I won? Brian had to be honest. He had never heard of this information, let alone with it put together. At the very least, it made him heavily question what he thought he knew. Before this discussion, he thought this was an open and shut case due to the way people spoke about it. However, he now sees this is nowhere near the truth. He knew this because he had been trying to get a six-pack for years now and was consistently going up and down in weight, never being able to get it right. Now, not only does Brian now see there's a method trading in his belly for abs, he actually wanted to try it and see for himself. So here are the ab workouts I would use along with the diet we talked about. I would swap between these two, one strength and one aerobic, or if you already have normal cardio days, you can easily throw in some ab exercises as well. Hit them 3 to 4 times a week. Ab strength workout. Barbell rollout, 5 sets of 3 to 5 reps. Suitcase carry, 5 sets of 10 meters per hand. Reverse incline crunch, 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps. Hanging knee raises, 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps. Aerobic circuit, cycle through 3 to 5 times. Aerobic 3 minutes, Russian twist 1 minute, aerobic 3 minutes. Flutter kicks 1 minute, aerobic 3 minutes, planks 1 minute. Aerobic can be any type of aerobic training such as treadmill, stationary bike, or stair stepper. Everyone knows post-workout protein shakes are great for muscle growth. But what about after-work drinks? How does kicking back a few at happy hour or ending the evening with a nightcap affect our muscles? You probably know it's not great for your muscles, but is it actually bad? Well, we can confirm the first part and then tell you no, it's not good. As far as the second part, that's what this video is about. The video is going to explore this topic a little bit deeper and try to find out how many drinks you can have until you start losing your hard-earned gains. Nutrition and gym go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're okay when used alone, but beautiful things happen when you put them together. Generally speaking, people who go to the gym tend to be more careful with what they put in their body at the dinner table. Or do they? Surprisingly, the one area of nutrition where physically active people tend to fail is drinking. And we don't mean drinking water. Studies have shown a strong correlation between physically active individuals and drinking. It's been estimated that 88% of studies that have looked at the relationship between physical activity and drinking alcohol find a positive relationship. While this number does drop when excluding college-age students, it's not much. In total, 75% found a positive relationship. That's a lot. What's even crazier is there actually seems to be a dose response to drinking and physical activity. In other words, the more you drink, the more you exercise. For example, when compared with current abstainers, drinkers perform exercise for longer durations per week. Where it gets interesting is the correlation between the amount of exercise and the amount of drinking. Light drinkers train 5.7 minutes more weekly, moderate drinkers train 10.1 minutes more weekly, and heavy drinkers train 19.9 minutes more per week. Further, if you drink, there's a 10.1% greater chance that you'll exercise vigorously. While we're not going to fully explain the why of this correlation, we are going to tell you what type of effect this drinking can have on your muscles. Even worse, a large percentage of 50 to 65% drink above the level classified as hazardous. As you can guess, this doesn't do anything good for your muscles. And you would be right. It's estimated that 40 to 60% of chronic alcohol abusers suffer from some sort of skeletal muscle disease, as well as muscle atrophy, a condition that causes a gradual loss of muscle mass. It's an obvious sign that drinking not only does nothing good for your muscles, but there's a good chance it'll result in a detriment. This is especially true with chronic heavy drinking. Even when we set aside all of the other unhealthy outcomes of heavy drinking, such as cirrhosis of the liver, alcohol intake still presents other problems for your body composition. Prolonged alcohol abuse can have detrimental effects, such as the total amount of muscle mass a person holds that we just mentioned. Unfortunately, that's not the only study. Research has found plenty of evidence to build a negative relationship between drinking and muscle, or maybe we should say muscle loss. In other words, those who drink more see less muscle growth. Specifically, the research showed that persons who drink regularly 3 or more drinks were the ones who had lower levels of lean body mass. What's more is that this loss wasn't attenuated with physical activity. Now, the participants were elderly men 65 years of age or older, and they weren't necessarily involved in resistance training. Unfortunately, there's not enough research to make a solid conclusion from this. Are the elderly just more prone to the negative effects of alcohol? Is general physical activity not enough to overcome the drop in muscle protein synthesis? We can't say for sure. However, that's 2 studies we've talked about that strongly suggest alcohol can cause greater loss of muscle. That's enough for us to want to learn more. What we can say for sure is that alcohol is not ideal for muscle growth. As you can probably guess, a loss in lean body mass wasn't the only negative effect in the elderly participants. Alcohol use also resulted in greater fat mass and less bone strength. In other words, a higher intake of alcohol has more than a few negative effects on your body. Ideally, lifters wouldn't drink. However, as we heard in the numbers above, this doesn't happen. Therefore, is there a number of drinks that drinkers can have that will mitigate any negative effects on muscle? And what exactly are the negative effects? That's what the rest of this video will look at. Before we go any further, let's first answer this question: what is alcohol? Now, we're not talking about the types of alcohol such as beer, tequila, or whiskey. We're talking about what is the actual compound, alcohol. Alcohol refers to a group of different compounds, so when we say alcohol, we're referring to the type of alcohol you drink. This specific type of alcohol is known as ethanol or ethyl alcohol, which is produced through fermentation of sugars by yeast. It's the active ingredient in alcoholic drinks that's responsible for the euphoric effects when consuming too much. Upon drinking, ethanol is absorbed into the bloodstream and brought to the brain, where it passes the blood-brain barrier. From there, it messes with both your neurotransmitters and neural pathways, neither in a good way. While the neurotransmitters decrease your inhibition, the neural pathways impair your coordination. Combined, they're what gives you a buzz or a drunk feeling. While most are pretty familiar with this feeling, along with its unhealthy side effects, many aren't so sure about what alcohol can do to your muscles. So, what are the effects of alcohol on building muscle? Well, one of the most studied relationships between alcohol and muscle hypertrophy is ethanol's effect on protein synthesis, particularly the mammalian target of rapamycin, more commonly known as mTOR. You see, the amount of muscle you have depends on 2 processes: muscle protein synthesis, MPS, and muscle protein breakdown, MPB. These processes are always going head-to-head with each other, and whichever rate is higher dictates whether you'll gain muscle or lose muscle. Therefore, your goal is to keep your rate of muscle protein synthesis as high as you can throughout the day while keeping your rates of muscle breakdown low. Now, one of the key signaling pathways involved in muscle protein synthesis is the protein kinase mTOR. Upon stimulation, mTOR phosphorylates will activate several downstream targets and initiate muscle protein synthesis. In other words, mTOR starts. Now, that's a very simplified explanation, as the entire process is terribly complex with multiple different processes and reactions. Unfortunately, this complexity leaves a lot of places where alcohol can affect and disrupt the entire process of building muscle. And it does. In fact, there is disruption both upstream from mTOR signaling as well as downstream. Basically, this means disruption at various locations throughout the entire process. For example, in terms of muscle building, leucine is thought to be the most important amino acid, as its presence directly activates mTOR. However, ethanol has been found to inhibit the level of stimulation that the amino acid leucine has on mTOR. As a result, the rate of muscle protein synthesis is blunted. Another mTOR pathway affected by alcohol is through the actual muscle contraction. Under normal conditions, continuous contractions of a muscle will stimulate muscle protein synthesis. However, when alcohol is introduced, it raises some issues. Research has found that ethanol can impair muscle contractions, which is a mechanical stimulation. What's interesting about this study is that the researchers had originally hypothesized that the alcohol would not have an effect on muscle protein synthesis by way of muscle contractions. That's because this pathway is independent of all other known pathways affected by muscle. Perhaps there are simply more pathways for mTOR and muscle protein synthesis, but more research needs to be done as we still don't understand all the ways that alcohol affects muscle protein synthesis. However, we do know one thing: alcohol affects our ability to build muscle in more ways than one. It doesn't look good for alcohol. Up to now, all the research and studies we've mentioned are more theoretical. What does this effect look like in real life with training? Are these drops in muscle protein synthesis enough to actually alter the amount of muscle we grow? Let's see what some research says. Well, one study from 2014 asked the question we've all thought before: what would happen if you added a couple of shots to your post-workout drink? No, seriously, that's what they did. 8 physically active young men performed a training program, followed by either drinking protein, alcohol, protein and alcohol, or carbohydrate and alcohol immediately after their training. They then had the same drink 4 hours later. Rates of muscle protein synthesis were then measured at 2 hours post-exercise and 8 hours post-exercise to compare. The first thing they found was that the rate of muscle protein synthesis was raised for all the groups. This includes the alcohol-only group, as the rise from training was enough to overcome the deficit from the alcohol. No problem then, yeah? Drink up. Well, not quite, so you should keep your glasses down for a minute. While muscle protein synthesis was still raised in the alcohol groups, it doesn't mean there wasn't a negative effect. When the alcohol was consumed alone, the participants saw a 37% reduction rate in muscle protein synthesis. While the deficit wasn't as great as when alcohol was consumed with protein, it still dropped 24%. But that's not the only study that had participants throw back a few after their lifting session. There's another study that looked at the effects of alcohol on muscle growth after resistance training. In addition, they also examined if there are differences between the sexes. A group of 10 men and 9 women followed an identical resistance training program consisting of 6 sets of squats. Immediately after their sessions, they drank either a placebo or an alcoholic drink. Further, muscle tissue samples were taken 3 times: pre-workout, 3 hours post-workout, and 5 hours post-workout. The researchers found that the resistance training elicited similar increases in mTOR C1 signaling in men and women. However, alcohol had a small negative effect on men. So just like the previous study we mentioned, the mTOR signaling in men still increased, albeit at a lower rate. This again suggests overall resistance training can overpower the negative effect of alcohol. However, it will still slow down your process. What these 2 studies seem to suggest is that while alcohol does have a negative effect, the positive effect of resistance training and protein is greater. Therefore, you will still see growth, but it'll be attenuated. While it's pretty clear that alcohol will have a negative effect on muscle protein synthesis, that's not the only problem. Alcohol can also magnify loss in performance post-training, which hints at blunting the recovery process. To be clear, a loss in performance is normal after training as the muscle is fatigued and damaged. However, when alcohol is added to the equation, the loss in performance is exacerbated. In a study, researchers had 10 healthy men perform 300 eccentric contractions of the quadriceps muscle to produce muscle damage. They then consumed ethanol or orange juice. This was then repeated with the opposite leg 2 weeks later, and the other beverage was consumed. Measurements were taken pre-exercise, then 36 hours later to measure post-exercise performance. The researchers found that alcohol produced a greater loss in isometric peak force of 39% versus 29%, and eccentric peak forces of 44% versus 27%. Even a larger detriment was found in the average force created, demonstrating alcohol affected repeat efforts to a greater degree. For isometric average peak torque, the orange juice saw a 29% drop, while alcohol saw a 41% drop. For concentric average peak torque, orange juice saw a 32% drop, while the alcohol group dropped by 43%. And the greatest drop was seen for the eccentric average peak torque. The orange juice group saw a 26% drop, while the alcohol group saw a massive 45% drop. While that study seems pretty conclusive that alcohol affects the recovery process, we must now turn our attention to this meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a scholarly review of all studies on a specific subject. In this case, it's all the studies of alcohol's effect on recovery. After all the research, they concluded that several recovery markers saw a negative effect. This includes an increase in cortisol, while testosterone, plasma amino acids, and rates of muscle protein synthesis decrease. However, all performance levels were "unmodified." This includes force, power, muscular endurance, muscle soreness, and rate of perceived exertion. Let's look at a study that saw this play out. In this study, participants drink alcohol during a resistance program with HIIT, high-intensity interval training. It's known as the beer HIIT study. In total, 83 participants aged between 18 to 40 took part in the study and were put into one of 5 groups, including one non-training group. Now, the other 4 groups were made up of 2 groups that drank an alcoholic drink throughout the training program and 2 that drank non-alcoholic drinks, which acted as placebo. Within the 2 alcohol groups, one was assigned to drink beer while the other drank vodka. Men would have 1 serving at lunch and 1 serving at dinner, which equaled 2 to 3 drinks, while women would have 1 serving at dinner, which equaled 1 to 2 drinks. As for the training program, rather than perform resistance training, the researchers decided to use HIIT with weight-bearing exercises, including 8 weight-bearing exercises of the frontal plank, high knee-ups, horizontal row, battle rope, squat, deadlift, push-up, and burpees. At the end of the study, it was found that the participants of all groups increased lean mass while decreasing fat mass. Further, there seems to have been no negative effect from alcohol consumption. It should be noted also that this study used a HIIT protocol rather than a proper program built for muscle growth. While HIIT is a great method of training to improve VO2 max, it's not ideal for building muscle. However, even a plan that was suboptimal for muscle building still resulted in an increase in muscle mass. Since now we've primarily been discussing the direct effect that alcohol has on your muscles, in that same breath, alcohol consumption can also affect your body composition and muscle growth indirectly through modifying your behavior. One of those is known as the drunchies. This is the phenomenon where we search for the greasiest fast food we can find after a night out. There's a reason why every bar street has a pizza place that stays open later than the bars. If you know what we're talking about, you'll also know that these places are always packed into the hours way past midnight. The point is that when we drink in excess, we tend to have big cravings. If you've ever felt ravenous as if you haven't eaten in a week, that's for you. We now have evidence that shows it's not entirely your fault, and there's a reason for it. Scientists have found that alcohol interacts with a group of neurons known as AGRP neurons. These AGRP neurons are what researchers believe to be the root of the problem. Why this is a problem is that the AGRP cells are starvation activated. In other words, they're activated during times of starvation to encourage rapid overeating. It's important to note that this stimulation is not dependent on an actual lack of energy or calories. This means that even if you had a nice big dinner before you went out, alcohol will still stimulate the AGRP neurons and cause you to order one of everything on the menu. Now, generally speaking, alcohol is already empty calories. These are foods and drinks that have no significant nutritional value but are high in calories. As a standard drink can have anywhere from 90 to 200 calories, 3 drinks will add 270 to 600 calories. However, if you can't control your hunger, then you go eat a bunch of junk food after, which has a lot of extra calories. It's safe to say on a night out, guys can easily eat 1,000 calories that weren't a part of their original meal plan. While these calories don't necessarily have a huge effect on your muscles, they will contribute to an increase in fat, which results in undesired changes in body composition. But that's not all. Another indirect effect of alcohol is on sleep. Sleep is crucial for optimum muscle growth, as it's the period where our body is in repair mode, such as the secretion of certain hormones like testosterone. In fact, research has shown that a single night of total sleep deprivation is sufficient to induce anabolic resistance and a pro-catabolic environment. Definitely not ideal for building muscle. Unfortunately, disrupting your sleep is exactly what alcohol does. In fact, even if you fall asleep after drinking, especially if you get drunk, the alcohol can still lead to poor quality sleep. Alcohol's effect on your sleep and hunger is more evidence that it causes an uphill battle with building muscle. Now that you know alcohol is definitely not the best thing for you if building muscle is your main goal, however, it's not going to nullify your gains completely, what do you do? Well, the first thing you need to do is personally assess how important building muscle is. If your number one goal is to put on as much muscle as you can in a certain period of time, you should definitely refrain from drinking. As mentioned, you can still build muscle while drinking, but it'll probably be attenuated. This can obviously depend on the individual along with how much you actually drink. Now, if you want to build muscle but it's not necessarily the most important aspect of your life, then you should follow a few basic rules. The first and most important primary rule is to only drink in moderation. Remember the beer HIIT study where the athletes were still able to gain muscle even though they had 2 to 3 drinks a day? While we definitely don't recommend you drink daily, We absolutely recommend keeping your consumption low in a single sitting. Studies show that chronic drinking and binge drinking have the greatest negative effects, both on your gains and honestly on your life and health in general. Your liver will thank you for refraining, that's for sure. This next tip has to do with your body composition rather than performance. If you choose to drink, consider sticking to the spirits, as they're on the lower end of the calories. A shot of tequila, rum, or vodka tends to have 70 to 90 calories. On the other hand, a beer can have 120 to 150 calories on average, and mixed drinks can easily have 200 or more per drink. Again, in a perfect world, we would never drink alcohol or eat processed foods or eat sweets or any of that. However, this world isn't perfect, nor should it be. Enjoying these things in moderation isn't going to have any major detriment to your progress. Emphasis on moderation. On the other hand, it's not going to help you at all either. Therefore, make the correct choice that's right for your lifestyle and goal. If you do decide to drink, stick to the tips we just gave you. However, if drinking isn't a huge aspect of your life, staying away completely is definitely the best choice. Protein shake or a pint of beer. The choice is yours. Calories in, calories out. Is that all there really is to fat loss? Nope. It's a lot more nuanced than that, and it's important to know if you're wanting to lose weight. If you've had trouble dropping pounds, you need to watch this video because we will drop the 50 biggest facts that no one tells you about losing weight. Be sure to stick around for the most important things you need to know. Speaking of dropping weight and dropping fat, that's a good place to start. The first thing that has gotten lost in translation is that fat is a good thing. We often talk about fat as if it's bad. In reality, you would die without it. Our bodies store fat to keep us alive during periods of no to little food. Unfortunately, we have taken advantage of this adaptation and have caused it to be harmful to our health. How harmful? We're going to get into that later in the video, but it's not good. As we're talking about burning fat, do you actually know what happens to the fat when you lose it? Everyone talks about losing fat, but no one tells you where it goes. That takes our number 2 spot. This is going to be a real fast explanation. When needed, fat is released as triglycerides, which are broken into compounds known as glycerol and fatty acids. These fatty acids then go through several reactions to create energy in the form of a compound known as ATP. From these reactions come 2 waste products, carbon dioxide and water. Your body then expels these through breathing, sweating, and urine, so you breathe out fat. Again, that's the simplified version. For number 3, let's look at some more confusion. Losing weight and losing fat are not the same thing. Did you know that the average poop can weigh up to 1 pound? This means if you weigh yourself, then go poop and weigh yourself again, you're going to lose 1 pound. But that's not fat you lost, it's poop. At the same time, it's not uncommon for some people to lose fat but gain weight due to muscle. They ultimately look better but are upset because the scale says they weigh more. Know this, the scale is merely one tiny tool to use to track fat loss. There are a lot of things going on in your body, and the scale should be part of other measurements to get the full picture. For example, are your clothes looser or tighter? Do you have more energy? Are your lifts better? How do you look in the mirror? What are people saying? Do not become a slave to the scale. The best way to combat this is number 4. Nothing tells you how to properly weigh yourself. Always weigh yourself first thing in the morning, after you go to the bathroom, and before you eat or drink anything. This is the best way to get an accurate representation of how much fat you are actually losing. However, keep in mind there are still other factors to keep in mind as we just said. However, this will give you the most accurate true reading. So how do you lose fat? Well, one of the easiest ways to lose fat is to sleep. Number 5 is that more sleep promotes fat loss and preserves muscle mass. Through a variety of mechanisms, getting more sleep encourages more fat loss. For example, one study had a group of individuals get into a similar caloric deficit, but one group got 5.5 hours of sleep versus 8 hours of sleep. Both groups lost 6.6 pounds of weight, however, the composition of this weight varied greatly. The group which only had 5.5 hours of sleep saw a 55% lower decrease in fat mass loss, but 60% more muscle loss. If you really want to lose fat, get enough sleep. As you can see, sleep is an easy way to self-sabotage your progress. Want to know another way? The 6th thing you need to know about losing fat is you must count calories. Okay, we know there are some who say they lost weight without. We also know there are plenty of people who maintain weight without counting calories. However, we would bet that at some point in their life they did. We're not saying you will need to count calories your entire life, but when you first actually diet, you need to better understand how many calories are found in food. That's because of the 7th thing no one talks about. People are awful at estimating, like the worst. Various studies show that people can underestimate the amount of calories they eat by 2,000. That's more than half a pound of fat. If you do that every day for a week, you'll gain 3 pounds of fat. This variance can range significantly. Therefore, take the time and count calories at first. It's no fun, but neither is gaining 3 pounds of unwanted fat. While we're on the topic of being terrible at guessing, the 8th thing no one talks about is how bad we are at estimating our activity levels too. You may hear people using watches that say they burned 700 calories in a basic aerobic class. They didn't. It's probably more like 300, as people tend to overestimate by 50 to 70%. If you're also underestimating how many calories you're eating, it's no wonder your fat loss isn't working. Speaking of not working, let's talk about what does work. Diets, all of them. The 9th thing that no one talks about is that every diet works for losing fat so long as there are 2 variables. These variables are getting into a caloric deficit, and this, the most important, drum roll, adherence. You got to be able to follow a diet you can stick with if you want to lose weight. Long-term studies have shown this to be the case. There may be some difference in weight loss in the beginning months. For example, low-carb diets tend to encourage more weight loss faster. However, meaningful weight loss occurs in the long term, and in the long term, every diet works. This is why you must find a diet that fits your lifestyle. You might be taken back by hearing long-term. How long is long-term? For number 10, the thing no one talks about is that fat loss is a longer process than you think. Under normal conditions, it's suggested a person gets into a deficit of 300 to 500 calories. Now, in order to lose 1 pound of fat, you need to burn 3,500 calories. This means you should expect to lose anywhere from 0.6 to 1.0 pounds of fat a week or 2.5 to 4.0 pounds in a month. Now, this is much slower than most people are planning on. The reason it's so slow is to mitigate muscle loss or lower the metabolism, which can occur when the caloric deficit is too high. For those with a lot of weight to lose, you could bump this up to 1,000 calories. This would equate to 2 pounds a week or 8 pounds a month. This is a little faster, but keep in mind this is for people who are obese, so they have a lot to lose. However, be sure to watch to stick around to get the full picture. While we're talking about calories, let's look at number 11. People need to start telling you that calories are not just calories. The gist of a calorie is well intended and a good place to start. However, this phrase is usually used to insinuate that it doesn't matter where you get calories from, as it will have the same effect. That's a very basic understanding. Different foods can affect the body differently, as well as providing other nutrients such as minerals and vitamins. So yes, a calorie is a calorie, but that doesn't mean the source won't be more or less beneficial for the body. Number 12 is a good example of this. It has to do with what's called the thermal effect of food, or TEF for short. When you eat a food, the body must spend energy to digest the food, transport the nutrients, and expel the waste. Simply put, TEF is the amount of calories it takes for your body to digest and use a certain food. Your 3 macros all have different TEF scores. Fat is about 1%, carbs are at about 10%, and protein is a whopping 20 to 30%. This means if you were to eat 100 calories of protein, you would burn 20 to 30 calories by way of TEF. As a result, if a person ate the same amount of calories, but one person ate a greater percentage of protein, the person that ate more protein would theoretically lose more weight, as they would burn more calories burned through the TEF of protein. Speaking of protein, let's look at number 13. When you are losing weight, no one tells you you actually want to increase the amount of protein you eat. This seems contradictory, as you also want to decrease your total calories. You do. Therefore, you increase your protein intake and then decrease your carb intake to compensate and hit your desired calories. Now, there are 3 good reasons for this. The first is the higher TEF we just mentioned. Secondly, the extra protein can help mitigate muscle loss. And 3, protein has the greatest satiety effect of all the macros. Protein is harder to digest, so it sticks around in your digestive tract longer, keeping you satisfied. That's also why it creates a higher TEF. For number 14, we're going all the way back to the beginning. Why do we even get fat? The irony is that storing fat is an evolutionary advantage, as it acts as stored energy during times of no or low food intake. The problem is that now food is available everywhere. Unfortunately, our bodies haven't adapted to this plethora of food, so it does what it's supposed to do. It stores calories for later. We then eat an hour later, so our body never has a chance to use the already stored fat, so we save more. So on and so on. That seems simple, but there are other things going on. The 15th thing people don't talk about is how psychology plays a major role in fat loss. There are those on the extreme other side who will tell everyone they need to just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and lose weight. To some extent, this is true, but for this to occur, the psychological component needs to be addressed first. This can range from emotional eating, eating late at night, or depression. Our minds play a large factor on what we eat. Luckily, there are several organizations out there which are taking this aspect of dieting seriously. If you know what to do and what not to do but keep doing it, you may want to look at one of the organizations. Okay, let's get 16 out of the way because you're not going to like it. Nothing good comes from drinking alcohol if losing weight is a priority. Yes, we know that you can just have a couple if you account for the calories. For one, alcohol has empty calories. And no, there is no such thing as a low-calorie alcohol drink, because the actual alcohol compound has calories. To be exact, 1 gram of alcohol has 7 calories. What this looks like in real life is that the cleanest, purest alcohol that people drink, vodka or clear rum, still has around 70 to 80 calories per shot. Still, alcohol also stimulates your AGRP neurons, which are your starvation neurons. In effect, it makes you feel extremely hungry even if you just ate. You probably know this, so now you know why. What makes it worse is usually people gravitate towards oily and processed foods. If that's not enough, alcohol can disrupt your sleep. We already spoke about that earlier. So we're not saying you can't drink, just understand the risk. Now for something positive. For number 17, you actually can perform a proper body recomposition. By this, we mean you can lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. And we're not talking about new lifters. Experienced lifters have been shown to lose weight while putting on muscle mass, and we've already spoken about the secret, protein. Every study that has demonstrated a proper body recomposition has used high protein intake above 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. At the same time, you need to be in a minimal caloric deficit. No more 200 to 300 calories, and get plenty of sleep. Now, the muscle gain and fat loss will not be as dramatic as doing one at a time, but it can save you the trouble of needing to bulk and cut. Now the research is still lacking to give you an exact protocol, but know that it's not impossible. Another fat loss myth that needs to be revisited, number 18, is that you can perform spot reduction. Well, maybe. Now there's still a lot of nuance that's involved with this, but we still want to mention it, as there does seem to be some possibility. In fact, there are 2 studies that have shown this to be possible, but there are some caveats. The main one being that it seems to occur primarily in the stomach area. What both studies did was use endurance training with abdominal exercises, for example, cycling for 5 minutes, then performing sit-ups for 1 minute and repeating this cycle for a length of time. The theory of how this works has 2 mechanisms, the first being that it depletes the glycogen levels of the muscles. This forces the body to draw from fat stores near the working muscle. And second, the ab exercises create more heat in the stomach area, which makes it easier for the fat in that area to be used for energy. So next time your fat expert says you can't, you can now be the well, actually guy. While we're on exercises, we should also clear up another myth. Number 19 is that there are no fat-burning exercises. By this, we mean that there is no specific set of exercises that you should use to burn more fat. All exercises work by increasing caloric burn, and that's it. Walking on a treadmill, pushing a sled, a circuit set, all of them will require energy and will also burn fat. Choose what fits your goals best. Okay, number 20 isn't a huge deal, but we got to get it off our chest. You've probably heard people talk about Tabata a lot in terms of weight loss, but probably have never heard the truth. Tabata is not for fat loss. Also, Tabata is the surname of a Japanese sports researcher who invented the protocol and is still alive today. In fact, some of his more recent papers noted how most people doing Tabata aren't actually doing Tabata due to their misunderstanding of what it is. The primary purpose of Tabata is to increase VO2 max in a minimum amount of time. It's only 4 minutes long, so how many calories do you think you can actually burn? If you're going to use Tabata for fat loss, pick one exercise you can perform at high intensity. Cycling is ideal, but things like mountain climbers and burpees could also work. Since we just talked about Tabata, it made us think of HIIT. Number 21 is that HIIT is no more effective at helping you lose weight than steady-state cardio. Both are awesome, and everyone should have at least one session of each in their training program weekly. People need to stop pitting training regimes against each other as if it's one or the other. This brings us to number 22. We wish experts would start promoting simple cardio to new trainees. Many people wanting to lose weight are out of shape. However, they try to go perform high-intensity exercise, and they simply don't have the fitness levels to benefit from the training. They either gas out early or get hurt. Rather, jumping on an incline treadmill for an hour is low impact and will burn a ton of calories while also giving the lower body muscles a nice little burn. Burning calories does not need to be complicated. For number 23, let's stick with errors found in the gym when people are losing weight. This is a big one and might blow your mind. Too many people put way too much emphasis on burning calories in the gym. Well, you absolutely should use the gym for fat loss, but the primary goal shouldn't be to burn calories. We'll explain what you should do for number 24. Figure this: how often does the average person go to the gym? 3 to 5 times a week? For about an hour? Hour and a half? At max, that's only 7.5 hours max for the whole week. If this is what you're relying on for your fat loss, you are going to be hurting. Rather, you need to pay attention to how active you are outside the gym. This is known as NEAT, or non-exercise aerobic thermogenesis. It's any type of activity that's not specifically for training. This is where the idea of daily 10,000 steps comes in. Take your dog for a walk, ride a bike to the gym, stroll on the beach or around the house for an hour after dinner. This is highly effective and may be the secret to weight loss if there is one. Increase daily activity and watch your calories. Done. So let's explain what you should do in the gym. Number 25 is that the gym has two functions: increase muscle mass or maintain muscle mass. You can run around and burn calories anywhere, but where else are you able to apply a significant stimulus to the muscles? Nowhere. We understand the desire to do things like circuits and other fat-burning type training, and that's fine. However, you should train each muscle group with at least one primary compound exercise with a heavy enough weight to mitigate muscle loss. If not, you are forfeiting this benefit. You can burn calories with your NEAT and control calories with your diet. It's a trifecta of weight loss. Now, you're probably thinking that you want to keep your muscle because it burns so many more calories than fat, yeah? Increase your metabolism? Well, number 26 is that muscle isn't going to result in a ton of extra calories burned, as some would have you believe. The number 50 seems to be thrown around some, suggesting 1 pound of muscle burns 50 calories a day. That's just insane. In reality, the number is closer to 4.5 to 7 calories. It's not that much. Now, this does not mean you should just lose your muscle. Absolutely not. You still want to keep your muscle because it makes you stronger and improves your physique. Plus, you worked for it. Further, having more muscle mass as you age will mitigate issues with sarcopenia, the natural wasting of muscle. Therefore, during your weight loss journey, lift weights with the intent of keeping all your muscle. Speaking of aging, number 27 may rub some of you the wrong way. Our metabolism only slows as we age because we become lazy. Ouch! That hurts to say, which is why no one says it. But it's important to know the truth to fix the problem, but people don't say it. This claim is often used by adults in a nonchalant manner to explain why they have gained weight. Oh, so it's not because you stopped working out and started eating fast food every day? Now, it is true that metabolism does tend to drop in adults after 30, but it's not because of biology. Like we just said, it drops due to inactivity and poor diet. The reality is that our metabolism shouldn't really slow until about 60 years old. For number 28, we really wish people would tell you that there aren't any special tricks to lose fat. In fact, many will tell you there are. Drinking vinegar before sleep, always eating carbs with protein, or taking cold showers. Maybe there are some minor health benefits to these, but they're not melting fat off your body. All the majority of people need to do is stop eating processed foods, stop eating fast food, and stop eating or drinking food with added sugar. In fact, a good portion just needs to stop eating candy, snacks, and drinking cola. Seriously, doing that would do absolute wonders for a good portion of people. Cut those foods out and see what happens. But what can make you fat? Well, it seems to depend on what decade you were born. Number 29 is society is always going through cycles of scare tactics concerning fat loss. In the 90s, it was fat that made you fat. In 2010, it was any food made in the past century with the paleo diet. Now it's any carb. Any and all carbs make you fat. If you stopped eating every food that had ever been part of these scare tactics, you would starve to death. The point is, don't let scare tactics control your diet. Ironically, the only food that has never really seen these types of health scare campaigns is fast food. The only food that deserves it. 2 words: sensibility and moderation. However, for this to work, we need to acknowledge number 30, which is that we need to consider the personal behavior of people and not just studies. What happens in the lab doesn't necessarily happen in real life. For example, sure, maybe eating after a certain time doesn't really matter in terms of fat loss while in a research setting. However, in real life, setting a time which someone can't eat after could have huge effects. Maybe they tend to eat a lot of junk food in the evening, and not eating at night prevents this. Therefore, we need to respect the experiences of individuals. If someone finds something works for them, then cool. No need to tell them they're wrong. At the same time, if something works for you, don't force it on everyone else. Actually, there is one group of people who need to tell others what to do. For 31, one thing people don't talk about when it comes to fat loss is the parent's role. Parents need to realize the massive effect they can have on the eating behaviors of their children. Children who come from a home with obese parents who practice poor eating habits are significantly more likely to also develop poor eating habits and become obese. This then becomes a perpetual cycle and continues until someone, maybe you, breaks the cycle. On the other hand, if you teach your child good eating habits, there's a good chance they'll never have to worry about losing fat to a significant degree. Speaking of children, there is another very important fact we must talk about. For 32, we need to talk about the rise in childhood obesity. It keeps rising and rising every year. Today, it's estimated that about 1 out of every 5 children are obese. And to be clear, this is obese, not overweight. In the 1930s, the rate of obesity in male children was 0% and just 2% in girls. It was barely even a thing. We need to work together to bring it back down to these levels, but it will only happen if we change our behavior. And what about the adults? Not much better. In fact, it's a lot worse. For number 33, we wish people would talk about the prevalence of obesity in adults as well. It's about 41%. Again, that's obesity. This number continues to rise and rise and rise every year. What's ironic is it keeps rising even though we have more education, weight loss tools, pills, creams, you name it. Obviously, these things don't work, even though people are trying. We'll find out how dangerous this is later. But one of the reasons for this is because people keep worrying about things that don't matter. Number 34 is you need to stop majoring in the minors. What this means is stop looking for various biohacks or putting all of your effort into staying away from certain foods or trying to increase your BMR or a special diet or whatever it is. These all have a minuscule effect, if any at all. There is no secret or trick or fast way to do it. You've heard this said in other ways, but keep your fat loss strategy simple. If you're wondering what BMR is, it stands for basal metabolic rate, and is the main subject of number 35, it doesn't increase that much. So this one has some nuance, so pay attention. BMR is the amount of calories your body burns at rest and accounts for 60 to 70% of your total calories burned. Many people try to use all these hacks to increase their BMR, but these hacks actually have a small effect. In addition, many of the things you do to increase BMR are things you should be doing anyways, like lifting weights, eating healthy foods, staying away from alcohol, getting good sleep, etc. You should definitely be doing these anyways. What you don't need to worry about is taking cold showers or eating peppers. You can if you love it, but these little hacks have minimal effects on your total BMR. Again, increase your activity and watch your nutrition. The reason this is so important is in our number 36, you can't out-train or out-biohack a poor diet. Sure, maybe you took a really cold shower and trained 2 hours every single day. You can still gain weight by eating too much. However, if you do none of that but eat less calories than you need, you will still lose weight. Do you see what we're saying? Your diet is what controls your weight gain or weight loss and is where your attention should be. Always. However, while you should focus on your diet, we need to talk about fasting. Number 37 is that intermittent fasting doesn't work. Or maybe it does. Intermittent fasting doesn't work for some people, but it does work for others. It's just not a miracle. Disclaimer: this is not addressing other health benefits, as that's outside the scope of this video. With that said, there is no miracle mechanism of fasting that somehow causes you to burn more calories. The primary mechanism by which fasting helps burn fat is it controls the amount of calories a person eats. If you usually snack from the time you wake up until you go to bed, and then only give yourself 4 or 6 hours to eat, you're probably going to eat less. However, some people manage to still eat a ton of junk food and still reach a caloric surplus, or they cheat. Therefore, it may or may not work for you, but the primary mechanism is simply calorie control. Saying that fasting works is essentially saying eating less works. Yes, it does, so if fasting helps you eat less, then awesome. We now want to share with you a hack that actually does work. Number 38 is that many people will eat healthy naturally from working out. Have you ever noticed that when you work out, you naturally eat better? This is a real phenomenon that occurs due to alterations in the way your brain works. Working out causes changes to occur and improves your executive function. Executive function is the part of the brain that helps you make good choices. So oftentimes, if a person simply starts to work out, they will naturally clean up their diet. This doesn't mean you don't need to watch your diet, but it shows that weight loss occurs optimally through multiple mechanisms and will probably be easier. Speaking of all the different mechanisms that affect fat loss, let them occur slowly. Number 39 is to stop trying to fix everything right away. There are probably a lot of things you need to change in your life to optimize your fitness levels and fat loss. Too often, people try to change everything on day one. As a result, they become overwhelmed and hate life and quit. The phrase 1% better every day has never been more true than with fat loss. Make small changes daily or weekly to help you build good habits without becoming overwhelmed. This ultimately brings us to number 40. Fat loss is a lifetime process. So many people are mainly interested in quick fixes. While these can work, they must be accompanied with actual changes in behavior. That's because the awful truth is it doesn't matter how much weight you lose, because you can gain it back easily once you revert back to your old ways. That's why we say there are no shortcuts. Once you lose weight, you must then continue doing what you're doing. For how long? Well, however long you want to keep the weight off. And while we're talking about how fat loss takes a lot of dedication, we need to mention number 41. Thermogenic pills don't make much difference either. There may be some benefits from them, but it's when they're used in conjunction with diet and exercise. Even then, the effect is still small. As you can see, this falls in line with the whole gist of this video. Stop searching for secrets and shortcuts. Another thing that doesn't work, number 42, is that low-fat foods are largely sales tactics. Now, this isn't true for all of them, it is for a lot. Low-fat foods largely rely on our fear of fat. Therefore, they remove the fat but often add other ingredients to make up for the loss of flavor. This may either be artificial ingredients, added sugar, or extra sodium. Your best bet is to eat whole foods and not rely on these options. Not that you can't use them, just don't fool yourself into believing there is always a healthier option. Regardless, the easiest way to lose fat is to not get fat in the first place. Number 43 is that fat cells never go away. When you initially gain weight, you will develop new fat cells in the process. The primary job of these is to hold on to lipids. When you lose weight, these cells release the lipids and become smaller. However, they don't go away. Well, they can go away, but it requires liposuction or another similar process. This is one of the reasons why it's believed people gain weight back so easily after they lose weight. Unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do about this, but keep it in mind, especially if you have children. Mitigating the creation of these cells to begin with will make it much easier for them to maintain a healthy body weight. Another thing that doesn't help with weight loss: artificial sweeteners. Number 44 is that artificial sweeteners may actually increase your fat gain. Many people will use artificial sweeteners as a healthier option in an attempt to cut out calories. However, this doesn't seem to be a foolproof plan. A large meta-analysis determined that evidence from RCTs does not clearly support the intended benefits of non-nutritive sweeteners for weight management. In contrast, observational data suggests that routine consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners may be associated with a long-term increase in BMI and elevated risk of cardiometabolic disease. When looking at all the different studies, there is no consistent relationship between using artificial sweeteners and weight loss, and can even cause weight gain. There's a few theories why. One is that it can actually cause you to be hungrier and eat more. Other less medical-specific causes is it's suggested that many people that use artificial sweeteners simply use it without making any other changes in their life. They rely on this for their weight loss. Regardless of why, these are not the Holy Grail. Speaking of Holy Grails, as of today, number 45 is there are no Holy Grails. Why? Because it's an ongoing task. Your weight maintenance is just as important as fat loss. Lately, Ozempic has been making the rounds and does show promise. However, what researchers have noted is that many people who lose weight with Ozempic gain it right back after use. Now, this doesn't mean Ozempic doesn't work. It means that unless you change your habits, you will never keep your weight off even if you do lose it. We can apply this to anything. This is why learning sustainable habits is a must. But there is good news. Number 46 is that everyone can lose weight. Some people will say that they've been dieting but haven't lost any weight. They will then conclude that they can't lose weight. The reality is that there are very few people who can't lose weight. What's more likely is you're messing up somewhere. Maybe you are missing some calories when counting them, or maybe your activity levels are lower than you think. If you're not losing weight, don't just throw your hands up. Go back to the drawing board and try to find what is going wrong. Let's look at food for a bit again. Number 47 is that you can get fat, from carbs, or from protein. You will become fat regardless of these if you get into a caloric surplus. This alone shows you why low fat doesn't make a difference if you just replace it with carbs. The only one that can make any type of difference is protein, but excess amino acids can still be converted into fat. Essentially, this is just another way to tell you that you need to control calories. We also need to make one thing clear about fat. Number 48 is that there are two types of fat held on the body, known as adipose tissue, visceral and subcutaneous. Visceral tissue is adipose tissue that's held around your organs, while subcutaneous tissue is the tissue under your skin. Now, both can be bad and detrimental to your health. However, visceral fat brings about serious issues and is more often associated with things like diabetes, cancer, and hypertension. Unfortunately, researchers still don't have a solid way to target one over the other. Now let's talk about some more confusion with nomenclature. The 49th thing that people fail to tell you is that burning fat is not the same as losing fat. This exercise is going to burn fat right off your body. Huh? We hope so. That's literally one of the main functions of fat. The body is always burning fat for fuel, as it's the body's stored source of energy. However, this doesn't necessarily convert into actually losing fat. People will hear that fasted training increases fat burned and automatically assume this means fat loss. It doesn't. Quick thought experiment. Let's say that you eat a bowl of oatmeal and then go for an hour-long cardio session. Your body will utilize those carbs for fuel. Now let's say you do your cardio for an hour fasted. Now your body will be forced to burn fat for fuel. However, when you get home, you then eat the same amount of oatmeal. Now your body won't use the carbs and they'll be stored as glycogen or turned into fat. See what we mean? Remember in the beginning of the video we talked about how long weight loss takes? Well, number 50 is that while you should lose weight slower than you thought, it shouldn't be too slow. Several studies have shown that faster weight loss in the beginning can lead to greater overall weight loss without a greater chance of regaining it back. So, what's fast? In this study, women who lost 1.5 pounds of fat per week saw greater overall fat loss. As you can see, this would equate to a deficit of 750 calories and isn't terribly faster than the suggested 1 pound per week. We reached number 50, but make sure to stick around for 2 bonus ones. Now, many people say that education is part of the reason obesity is such a major problem. However, more people need to tell you that we learned the most important nutrition information in elementary school. Eat whole foods, make your plate colorful, eat plenty of fruits and veggies, and who remembers the pictures of chicken and fish for protein? Bam! That's what you need to do. Today, people insist on making losing fat so complicated. We need to get back to a time where fat loss is simple again. For the first bonus one, we need to get serious. We all know that obesity is bad for our health, but not enough people are talking about is that after age, weight was the #1 predictor of outcome during the COVID-19 pandemic. That is, young people who were of normal weight had a very low risk of severe outcome. On the other hand, the more overweight a person was, it resulted in a worse outcome. This included greater risk of infection, hospitalization, clinically severe disease, mechanical ventilation, ICU admission, and even death. But COVID isn't the only health risk. In fact, for the second bonus one, we're going to end with the most important thing people aren't talking about enough. The most important reason you lose fat is not for aesthetics. Looking good is cool, but it is not the most important reason why we need to take fat loss seriously. The most important reason is for our health. As a society, we must take fat loss seriously as obesity is the #1 preventable factor of death and disease in the world. Diabetes, cancer, heart tension, stroke, all of these can be largely reduced simply by losing fat. Creatine, easily the single most effective supplement on the market today. There is no question about this. You take creatine and you get bigger and you get stronger. You also go bald, experience kidney failure, cramp up, and the worst of it, you get fat. At least that's what some like to claim. Is it true? Is creatine actually bad for you? Dan doesn't think so, but he'll have this belief tested today. He had just finished up his training session and, per usual, stopped at the gym's cafe and ordered himself a nice big post-workout protein shake. He was going down the menu. Chunky Monkey, Peanut Paradise, Banana Rama. That Peanut Paradise sounded good. Oh, and could you add a scoop of creatine, please? Dan asked. Out of nowhere, a piece of unsolicited advice came from across the bar. I wouldn't do that if I were you. One of his fellow gym members, Alex, had just offered his opinion to Dan, insinuating that adding creatine to his shake was a bad idea. Did you know that creatine is actually bad for you? There have been a bunch of studies to show it's not good for your body and causes serious health issues. Dan had heard rumors of so-called negative side effects but had always ignored them. It seems that everything was bad for him these days. He had once heard that even protein powder was bad for him. He was pretty well read and believed that creatine was the most effective supplement on the market. How could it also be bad for him? At the same time, he didn't want to put anything in his body if it was going to cause him harm. So when he was done with his workout, why not look into these claims a bit more? Dan bit and asked the gym member what he was talking about. What Dan had just done was set himself up to hear a barrage of claims of how creatine is going to affect his health. Before they get into it, it's important to understand what creatine is, to understand if it's safe or not. There's something very important that you need to know. Are you ready? This may be a shock for you, but right now as you watch this video, every single person on Earth as we speak has creatine coursing through their veins. Well, actually it's stored in their muscles, but still, it's already inside all of us. There is a common misconception that creatine is some foreign substance that you are injecting into your body, like a drug, a steroid. While creatine found in supplements is technically made in a lab, it is the exact same found naturally in your body. So first off, creatine is a natural compound that is essential to support life in humans and many animals. Dan felt better knowing this as he actually wasn't really sure where or what creatine was. But if he has it in him, how did it get there? There are two ways Dan's creatine stores are filled naturally. The first is by consuming it through his diet. However, it's only found in animal products, with the best sources being red meat and certain fish. Wait a minute, Dan's best friend is a vegan. How does he get creatine? Well, vegans actually have lower creatine levels because of this. Their body must rely on the alternative means of supplying creatine through the synthesis of the 3 amino acids glycine, arginine, and methionine. This begs the question, if creatine is natural, then why do we even need to supplement with it? Diet significantly impacts creatine levels. For example, vegans tend to have lower creatine levels due to the lack of animal products in their diet. While there is a finite amount, most people are only walking around with their creatine storage only 60 to 80% full. Therefore, when we take supplemental creatine, we are simply filling up our stores to 100%. It's like stopping at the gas station to fill up the gas tank before a long road trip. That's it. Many people, probably Alex, like to dismiss creatine and say things like, "It just gives you a little bit of energy." Creatine does not just give the body a little bit of energy. When framed like this, it makes it sound as if creatine is a stimulant, like caffeine. Nope, creatine contributes energy that is vital for muscle movements. That's like saying that coal just gives a train a little bit of energy, when in fact the train would stop moving without it. This is similar to creatine. Your body requires the presence of a compound known as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, to provide energy to drive muscle contractions. When required, a phosphate compound will break off of ATP, which releases energy. However, ATP has now become a compound known as ADP, adenosine diphosphate. The problem is ADP cannot be broken down to provide energy anymore, so the body must replenish its stores of ATP. Your body has 3 methods to do this, depending on the need for more ATP and the intensity of exercise. One of these is the phosphagen system. The phosphagen system is used to provide energy during high-intensity activities such as weightlifting. It needs ATP fast, and it needs it now. Therefore, when Dan supplements with creatine, he's simply filling up his creatine stores. Once he gets in the gym, this will help him perform more work. He can knock out another rep or 2 or put on a little more weight. Over time, all of this extra work translates into bigger, stronger muscles. That didn't sound bad to Dan at all, so why are people so concerned with creatine supplementation? One word: case studies, yelled Alex. Look at this case study. In the scholarly world, a case study is a type of scientific paper that documents the occurrence of a singular person. For example, let's pretend a group of scientists are trying to research if a new candy bar makes you sick. A research study would look at all the people who eat that candy bar and document how many people get sick. They would then run their numbers and determine if there is a connection. On the other hand, a case study would find the one person who does get sick and document their experience. While we can learn a lot from case studies, we can't make a broad determination from them. For example, maybe only one person got sick after eating the candy bar out of the 1,000 people who ate it. That's 0.1% of the people, which is hardly convincing that you would get sick if you ate that candy bar. Well, this is the same scenario as what has happened with the use of creatine. There have been some rare occurrences where it seems as though a healthy person taking a recommended dosage of creatine has had medical issues. The most serious concern with creatine supplementation is that it can lead to acute kidney failure. Like most people against taking creatine, Alex claimed that the supplementation of creatine places a greater workload on the kidneys. Alex had been talking about a case study from 2011 that documented the events surrounding a healthy 18-year-old male who supplemented with creatine. He followed a normal protocol of taking 20 grams a day for 5 days and then just 1 gram a day for 6 weeks. Even though this is the prescribed protocol, he was admitted after vomiting, muscle tenderness, and stomachache for 2 days. He was experiencing acute renal failure and had serum creatinine levels twice the normal range. Following treatment, including IV therapy, he was discharged from the hospital in good health 25 days later. Dan had never heard of this and was a bit taken back at first, and rightfully so. He should be aware of any risk, no matter how small, that's involved with putting anything in his body. The secret is not to exaggerate the risk. Dan wanted to read the study himself and found some very interesting statements. For example, in the study it says, "Extensive research over the past decade has shown that oral creatine supplementation appears to be safe when used by healthy adults at recommended loading," and "The potential side effect of creatine supplementation, kidney damage, was based on case reports only and was associated especially with high doses of creatine supplementation or renal disease." This basically means that when there are a small number of adverse reactions, it usually occurs with those who already have renal disease or are taking more than recommended. For example, let's pretend you break your foot, and then someone tells you to go for a mile walk. When you get back, you're going to be in crazy pain. But does that mean walking is bad for your foot? Of course not. It means walking is bad when your foot is already broken. And this is what this case study ultimately concludes. In fact, the case study even linked to 3 reviews that also state this. For example, in 2000, a review appropriately titled "Adverse Effects of Creatine Supplementation, Fact or Fiction" was released. This review brought together numerous studies ranging from 4 weeks to 5 years. They too conclude that apart from anecdotal reports and case studies, that they believe that there is no evidence for deleterious effects in healthy individuals. Okay, so Dan felt pretty good about his kidneys. But then Alex warned Dan that if he kept taking creatine, he was going to go bald. As Alex was getting older, he was a bit worried about his hairline. Balding is definitely one of the biggest cosmetic concerns that men face as they age. His dad and grandpa are bald, so he figured it will be his time soon enough. However, he'd like to postpone it as much as possible. It just so happens that balding is one of the potential side effects. Not necessarily dangerous, but it's actually the one adverse effect that worried him. This claim first formed from a study back in 2009, with a study using male college rugby players. After finishing a typical 3-week protocol, the players' DHT levels were found to be significantly higher above baseline. DHT is a metabolite of testosterone and can bind to androgen receptors in hair follicles, causing them to shrink and eventually stop growing. While this seems like a close and shut case, it's not so clear. Further, no study since has replicated these results. It appears that this concern is yet another result of a study having its results exaggerated and spread around as fact. Dan thought he was out of the woods, as it seems that these claims about creatine seem to be the result of exaggerated claims. But Alex had a lot of issues with creatine. He had a few more concerns he felt needed to be addressed. The next issue was that of cramping and dehydration. Alex pointed to a study from 2000 that looked at creatine use in college athletes. In this study, a large group of athletes from different sports were provided with a self-reported survey on their use of creatine and any side effects. In one group, 38% reported muscle cramping. In yet another group of athletes, another 25% reported cramping and 14% reported symptoms of dehydration. The theory is due to creatine's osmotic properties. That means it draws in water. This is actually cause for another concern, which will be brought up in a bit. So the theory is that creatine is held in the muscle and draws in water. However, even during times of overheating, creatine retains the water and prevents it from being distributed to cool the body down. Sounds bad, Dan thought. So he went ahead and took a look at the study himself, and he's glad he did. He found that 91% of the participants were taking more than the recommended dose. At the same time, as this was a self-reported survey, it could not control other variables such as nutrition, sleep, hydration status, or even the use of other supplements. While Dan found it interesting, he knew this contradicted other studies he had read. One study had college-aged football players consume either creatine or a placebo for 120 days. Researchers monitored the players and documented adverse events. More importantly, they controlled the dosing of creatine. Ultimately, the researchers found the exact opposite happened. The creatine users reported significantly less cramping, muscle tightness, muscle strains, heat injury. They basically had fewer total reported symptoms. For a cherry on top, Dan actually knew another later study that even suggests creatine use offers benefits when training in hot and humid weather. But Alex wasn't done yet. Alex then told Dan that creatine would mess up his stomach. If Dan is going to experience any adverse effect, it would likely be this: stomach distress. This is most common in users during the loading phase. During the loading phase, you take significantly more creatine than normal, 20 to 25 grams a day. However, there's a few positives. For one, this is temporary and usually recedes once you start taking your maintenance dose of 3 to 5 grams. At the same time, if you tend to be sensitive to stomach issues, you can divert this whole issue and just take smaller doses. For example, during your loading phase, simply take 10 grams for 10 to 14 days. You could even take 5 grams a day, but know it will take 30 days to fill your creatine stores. Dan could also split the loading doses into several smaller doses during the day. In fact, you should. Don't take all 20 grams at once. Rather, you could take 4 grams 5 times a day. In most incidents where these minor issues did arise, improper use was a major factor. Further, the effects subsided after lowering the dose. Dan decided that this could be an issue, but it doesn't seem very serious, and the possible benefits of taking creatine were just too great. Therefore, he decided he would just split the doses up throughout the day during the loading phase and be mindful. If he started to feel some issues arising, he would just limit his dose. Alex was looking heavily depleted, just like his muscles, as he hasn't been taking his creatine. But he wasn't going to give up. He had to prove that creatine wasn't really good for you, so he pulled out one of the most common misconceptions and confusion surrounding creatine. But even if you take creatine, you don't really build muscles, it's just water weight. It can actually make you fat. The claim that creatine leads to water retention is one of the more prominent claims made, partially because there's some truth to it. However, even though there's a grain of truth, it's heavily misinterpreted. Creatine is osmotic, meaning that it draws in water to its location. Remember that creatine is stored within muscle tissue, which means that creatine does draw water into the muscle. But here's the thing, that's a good thing. Dan's muscle is already 70% water, and hydration is crucial for optimal function. In fact, when his muscle is hydrated, it will be something known as cell swelling. And researchers have found that this creates an anabolic environment, or an environment that promotes muscle growth. Now, there's some truth that muscle will absorb water at a rate that's disproportional to the amount of growth. One large cause of this is due to the loading phase in which a large amount is taken. What's interesting is that if Dan or Alex supplement for an extended period of time, their muscle growth will increase, and the amount of water their muscles absorb will return to a normal ratio when compared to the extra muscle mass. So yes, Dan will probably take on more water with his creatine consumption, as he will also gain more muscle mass. Every single claim that Alex brought up was easily disputed by digging just a little bit farther into the research. And this is when Dan left the studies and used some logic. He explained to Alex that creatine is easily the most widely used and studied supplement in the world. In a study from 2003, it states that there have been over 500 studies that have evaluated the effects of creatine supplementation on sports performance in healthy subjects. And that was over 20 years ago. Now there are significantly more. If creatine was such a hazard to our health, you would think these studies would have picked up on that. Rather, they have found the opposite. Again, the majority of negative claims come from case studies or studies that use faulty methodologies. These negative occurrences are picked up by the media and then exaggerated. In reality, Dan explained that creatine is the closest thing we have to a miracle drug. Its effect on sports performance is undeniable, and that's a huge claim to make in the world of exercise science where there is so much nuance. Researchers have since gone beyond the use of creatine for sports performance and have found it has a multitude of possible benefits. This includes improving cognition, acting as a neuroprotector, protection against traumatic brain injury, treating neurodegenerative conditions such as Parkinson's, possibly helping improve mental health and treating depression. The list goes on. As Dan went ahead and dumped his serving of creatine in his Peanut Paradise post-workout shake, Alex too ordered a Peanut Paradise shake. "Do you want a serving of creatine?" the barista asked, sheepishly looking around. Yes, I think I do." Dan had done it. He was able to educate another naysayer of the awesome benefits found in creatine. So if you want to take creatine, follow these steps to mitigate any chance of an adverse effect. Even though the chance is already extremely low, decide if you want to partake in a loading phase. Generally, this is 20 to 25 grams of creatine taken daily for 5 to 7 days. If you think you may be sensitive, you could cut this in half and double the days taken. 10 grams a day for 14 days. Also remember that you should split this across multiple doses throughout the day. For example, take 5 grams 5 times a day. After this, simply take 3 to 5 grams a day. Further, take with a glass of water and increase your hydration throughout the day. You're feeling good, weights are moving easy, and you think you're Superman smashing your workout. This is one of the best feelings in the world and is a high that many gym goers are chasing during their workouts. But while you may feel great in the gym, as your body begins to cool down afterwards, your muscles begin to tighten up, and your joints may start to get a little achy. And let's not even talk about waking up in the morning. A common way to ease this pain is to head to the kitchen cabinet, grab a bottle of ibuprofen, and pop a couple pills. There's no problem with getting a little pain relief to help you through your day. Right? Not exactly. If you have been taking painkillers to help you get through your workouts, you need to watch this video. We'll break down what it actually does to your muscles. Are you essentially trading your muscle gains for some relief? And stick around as we'll lay out some better ways to help relieve some pain that won't affect your muscle growth. Over-the-counter painkillers are a common tool used by lifters to deal with some of the aches and pains from lifting to allow them to continue training. There are two common types used. The first are categorized as NSAIDs, which stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Probably the most popular is ibuprofen. Here's how they work. Upon your muscle tissue being damaged, they produce a type of lipid compound called prostaglandins. These prostaglandins are released into the blood where they trigger an inflammatory response leading to tissue swelling, pain, and in some cases fever. These prostaglandins are regulated by COX enzymes. Taking NSAIDs will block the two types of COX enzymes, which essentially reduces the inflammation and fever. The other common type is the compound acetaminophen, with Tylenol being the most well-known brand. Acetaminophen is an analgesic and simply works by reducing body temperature and helps to relieve pain. With this in mind, we will primarily be looking at NSAIDs. Even though many people may take acetaminophen for muscle soreness, it's actually not going to really do anything to relieve pain. Acetaminophen primarily works by reducing temperature and headaches, but doesn't reduce inflammation, which is the primary cause of soreness brought about by exercise. At the same time, it can disrupt your body's thermoregulation, which isn't a good thing and could result in some issues. Regardless, while some studies will include acetaminophen use, our main interest are NSAIDs. With that said, keep these mechanisms in the back of your head as we're now going to go through some research on what happens when a person takes painkillers with their workouts. Then after, we're going to build a bridge between the mechanisms of painkillers and the results to build a full picture of why they do or don't help you. For muscle growth to occur, there isn't just one mechanism that controls its success. For example, to gain weight, you simply need to eat more calories. That's that. However, to build muscle, you also need to eat a surplus of calories, but that's just one aspect. You also need to train, but not just train, you need to lift more weight than you did the week before. In addition, your diet can affect muscle growth. For example, low-carb diets have been found to be suboptimal for muscle growth. Oh yeah, your hormones are also going to affect your muscle growth as well. These are just a few things that need to go right, but the primary mechanism that needs to occur is an increase in muscle protein synthesis. Unfortunately, there's a good chance that taking painkillers is going to blunt this process, resulting in less muscle growth. A study from 2002 looked at the use of both acetaminophen and ibuprofen on their effects on muscle protein synthesis. To do this, 24 males were involved in high-intensity eccentric exercise, performing 10 to 14 sets of 10 reps targeting the knee extensors. These 24 men were placed into one of three groups: 1,200 milligrams of ibuprofen, 4,000 milligrams of acetaminophen, and a placebo. In the placebo group, muscle protein synthesis was increased by 76%, while both painkillers groups saw no increase. You might think that no increase isn't all that bad because heck, at least it didn't decrease. But that's not how muscle protein synthesis works. Let's break down this process in more detail so you have a better idea as to why this isn't good for muscle growth. Muscle growth occurs depending on the relationship of muscle protein synthesis and another reaction known as muscle protein breakdown. Muscle protein synthesis is the building of muscle, while muscle protein breakdown is just that, the breakdown of muscle. Both of these reactions are always working. So if muscle protein synthesis is higher, the muscle will grow. If muscle protein breakdown is higher, the muscle will break down. Going back to this study, one of the ways that resistance training works is by increasing muscle protein synthesis. As we saw, when there were no painkillers involved, it increased by 76%. However, when painkillers were thrown into the equation, there was no increase. So while it didn't cause a decrease, it prevented any increase from happening, which mitigated the potential for muscle growth. In fact, this could even put you at more of a risk of losing muscle if muscle protein breakdown were to rise. So this study looks like a shut and closed case, but not so fast. Let's look at another study that will turn this study on its head and cause some confusion along the way. In 2011, there was a follow-up study using a very similar design. 36 older adults around 65 years of age participated in a 12-week progressive overload program aimed at increasing knee extension strength. These individuals were then separated into one of three groups: an ibuprofen group, an acetaminophen group, and a placebo group. Following the completion of this study, something very strange was discovered. Unlike the previous study, all of the groups saw an increase in muscle mass of the quadriceps. But wait, it gets a little crazier. In this study, both of the drug groups saw greater growth than the placebo. To be clear, taking either ibuprofen or acetaminophen resulted in a greater amount of growth than not taking anything. This means they provided an ergogenic benefit. In addition, all groups increased muscle strength that was in proportion to the increase in size, which hints that the muscle gained was actual functional muscle. Researchers note that this growth was exceptional and that the drug groups basically reversed 10 years of muscle loss from sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is the natural process of muscle loss that occurs as we get older. Being able to reverse 10 years is huge. Now, if anything, we have two studies that suggest two very different outcomes, making it impossible to come to a final assessment. The one glaring difference is the age of the participants. The younger lifters seem to experience a negative effect, and the older lifters seem to see a benefit. Well, good thing there's more studies to examine. In 2017, a large meta was conducted that included 42 different studies. Most of these studies used injuries from eccentric muscle damage, while there were other causes of injury such as acute strain or running downhill. Further, a wide variety of various NSAIDs were used, indicating this was not isolated to a single brand. The researchers found a generally positive benefit of using NSAIDs to help improve recovery. But that's not the only big review. And to make things more complicated, other reviews have come to very different assessments. A large review from 2023 examined all of the available research on using NSAIDs to treat and reduce post-training soreness. They found out that the best thing you could hope for is no effect on muscle hypertrophy. Keep in mind, for this to happen, you should stick to a lower dose. However, higher doses in fact do have a negative effect on muscle growth and can even slow recovery. But wait, there's yet another big review, and this one is going to change everything we know. Actually, no, it won't. It says the same thing as the previous review. This large review from 2023 was performed to examine the effect that NSAIDs have on muscle recovery, muscle strength, and muscle damage at 24 and 48 hours post-exercise. And well, the results aren't great. We'll let you hear it straight from the horse's mouth. The data of the present meta-analysis indicate that NSAID use is ineffective in improving resistance performance and muscle strength, as well as exercise recovery. The present data supports that consumption of analgesic drugs as an endurance performance enhancer or as a muscle anabolic must not be recommended. So the differences in these studies was that one was looking at actual muscle growth and strength increase, while other markers examined were measuring the effect on muscle damage. What this suggests is that taking an NSAID may be beneficial at reducing pain, but will have no benefit towards increasing muscle mass and muscle strength, and could possibly even cause a decrease. So you're probably wondering why this is. Exactly how NSAIDs decrease inflammation, but at the same time decrease muscle growth and muscle strength. The first thing to keep in mind is that NSAIDs ultimately reduce inflammation by preventing the production of prostaglandins. This decrease in inflammation will in turn lessen discomfort. The problem is that inflammation actually plays a role in muscle growth and muscle repair. A paper published in 2022 titled "Role of Macrophages During Skeletal Muscle Regeneration and Hypertrophy: Implications for Immunomodulatory Strategies" details this relationship. What's interesting is this paper not only notes the role that NSAIDs play in mitigating muscle hypertrophy by preventing inflammation, but it points out that this is the same thing that happens with another very popular recovery method: ice baths. Yes, ice baths have also been found to blunt muscle growth. But a decrease in inflammation isn't the only mechanism which disrupts muscle growth. At the same time, NSAIDs are known to reduce the production of muscle signaling molecules known as myokines, which also plays a role in muscle hypertrophy. And we shouldn't forget the potential for decreasing muscle protein synthesis. Remember at the beginning of this video where we told you that there are a lot of things that must occur for muscle to grow, and NSAIDs seem to disrupt more than one? When all of these different mechanisms are affected negatively, it makes more sense that muscle growth isn't going to occur. This confusion comes from the misunderstanding of how muscle growth occurs. As we said, we see a similar issue with ice baths. Trainees will just figure that since they trained hard, their muscles will surely grow. Therefore, as no one likes to walk around with discomfort, they pop some pills as they let their muscles grow free from pain. Or so they think. They don't understand that these are interlinked. Unfortunately, they are. So decreasing discomfort by decreasing inflammation could in turn be decreasing improvements in muscle growth or muscle strength. But what to do about the pain? Don't worry, in just a little bit, we'll tell you how you can take NSAIDs while mitigating your chances of negative side effects. In addition, we'll give you some other options to mitigate discomfort during this video. But first, there's also another class of painkillers we need to discuss, ones that are a step above over-the-counter painkillers. We're talking about opioids. Of all the drugs in the world that have caused destruction in our country, perhaps there's not greater than that of painkillers, technically known as opiates. What were once prescribed to help people from pain they received from injuries or surgeries have quickly become one of the most popular recreational drugs in the world. However, unlike marijuana, which is relatively safe in terms of causing serious side effects or death, opiates aren't. Unlike NSAIDs, opioids work by blocking pain signaling in the central nervous system. At the same time, it floods your body with dopamine, one of your feel-good chemicals. Combined, these reduce your perception of pain and make you feel good rather than decrease your inflammation. Unfortunately, there's not much information on opioids use and muscle growth, which is odd as their use is so common. After researching this topic, it seems the primary area of research is the use of opioids with anabolic steroids. More specifically, there seems to be a connection in which steroid use can increase the chance of opioid addiction. Regardless, since opioids aren't affecting inflammation, there's likely a small chance that they'll have effects worse than NSAIDs on muscle growth, at least directly. However, they can definitely cause you to become drowsy and affect your energy levels, which would definitely increase your chance of performing less total work. Now, all of this is ignoring the fact that they are highly addictive. Regardless of their effect on muscle growth, using opioids should not be a legitimate option if you feel sore. If you are so sore that you need such a strong painkiller, you probably have a more serious injury. With the high chance of developing an addiction, opioids are a very dangerous drug to use recreationally for simple discomfort such as DOMS. While we're on this topic, it's time to speak about the issue that looms over this entire topic. We need to address why you feel you need to use painkillers in the first place. Sure, there are those times when training gets a little more intense or you're just having a great day and push it harder than normal. However, being so sore that you need to take painkillers every day points to an issue with your training. Let's remember that strength training should make us feel better, not worse. Why work out and strengthen our body if we're just going to tear our bodies down and hobble around all day? No thanks. We understand that there are rare occasions that you may have trained a bit harder than normal and may wake up a little sore. However, this should be on a rare occasion. The good news is that on a rare occasion, taking an NSAID isn't going to have a massive effect on overall muscle growth. This is especially true if you take a lower dose. Taking minimum doses of NSAIDs are going to mitigate any possible negative effect. But wait, there's more. We're not just going to leave you hanging with that. Rather, we want to leave you some tips that you can apply to yourself right now. So if NSAIDs can possibly blunt your muscle growth, what's a better way to mitigate pain and discomfort after training? Well, ice baths are often recommended, and while they can improve recovery, we already discussed that they produce similar issues as NSAIDs. So those are a no-go if you're increasing muscle growth. Therefore, as far as what you can do post-exercise, we believe that light cardio as a form of active recovery is your best bet. By light cardio, we simply mean going for a brisk walk or simple bicycle ride. Staying active seems to be the best overall method to reduce soreness, plus it lets you get in your 10,000 steps. Start trying to increase your daily activity post-exercise. This can be a short 15-minute walk immediately post-exercise, and then another light session later on during the day, depending on what time you work out. This later session can be longer, 30 to 60 minutes depending on your free time. But again, as we just mentioned, you shouldn't be experiencing a significant amount of soreness on a consistent basis. The best way to do this is to make appropriate increases with your progressive overload. For those unaware, progressive overload is the lifting principle, which simply states that in order to continually progress, you need to continually place a stressor of slightly greater magnitude on the muscle over time. Basically, do a little bit more work every week. Oftentimes, guys will go to the gym and train hard with no real goals and just lift weight until they can't lift anymore. While this is fun once in a while, doing this all the time is too much. Muscle growth occurs through a cycle of stressing a muscle and letting it recover. For this to happen, all you need to do is place a slightly greater amount of work on it when you get in the gym and then go home. That's it. Staying in the gym and beating up your muscle will do nothing but break it down more. If you keep this up, muscles can have trouble fully recovering, resulting in acute soreness as well as chronic overuse injuries. The main point is you don't need to destroy your body every workout session. All you need to do is apply some simple progressive overload protocols to your training, and your need to take painkillers after your workout won't even be a thing anymore. The exact protocol can vary widely. However, some general guidelines are to add 5 to 10 pounds to your lower body exercises per session and 1 to 5 pounds to your upper body workouts. Another option is to add reps. Instead of adding more weight, you just perform 1 or 2 more reps. The main goal is to put a little bit more work on the muscle and call it a day. Do this and your need for NSAIDs will almost disappear. Now, if you are taking NSAIDs for other issues, you basically want to use a lower dose. The exact amount can vary widely depending on what painkiller you are taking, but don't use the maximum dose if you are wanting to maximize your muscle growth. Why do we use different exercises to train the same muscle? It's a common question in the gym. If one exercise trains a muscle, then what's the point of doing more exercises to train the same muscle? Why not make things simple and just do 20 sets of bench press and call it a day? The short answer is that doing more exercises will maximize your results. There's no doubt about it. And the real question we should be asking is how many different exercises should we use? So we're going to try to attempt to find out how many and why. If you've been to the gym for any length of time, you probably noticed that a typical workout program consists of roughly anywhere between 5 and 9 different exercises. This seems to be the standard across the board. So our big question is why? More specifically, is this a good amount of exercises or should there be more? Or perhaps even less? There are actually a few things to consider before answering this question, the first being how much work can be placed on a muscle. Since one of the most important variables in the process of muscle growth is the muscle's ability to recover for the next training session. When we go to the gym, we're essentially breaking down a muscle. Lifting weights causes stress and inflammation, which will trigger an anabolic response or the rebuilding phase. When put together, this creates a cycle of continuously stressing a muscle followed by repair. In other words, stressing a muscle is an imperative part of growth, making it a good thing, provided you're able to recover from that stress, of course. A threshold exists, though, where too much stress can actually be a detriment as the muscle is unable to recover in a timely manner. So in order to know how many exercises we should do, we need to know where this threshold lies. On top of that, we need to find out what the benefit of training a muscle with various exercises even brings. Is there any point to using a bunch of exercises, or does it just make us feel good that we're doing something different? So let's first determine the maximum amount of stress a muscle can handle, and by handle, we mean its maximum recoverable volume. Volume is the total amount of work that we put on the muscle, generally measured in a week of training. This is sometimes calculated as the total amount of weight, which is found by multiplying the sets times reps times the load or weight. However, for the remainder of this video, we'll be speaking of set volume. This is the total amount of working sets you use to train a muscle. For example, let's say you're doing bench press and perform 2 warm-up sets followed by 3 working sets of 5 reps. The total set volume would be 3. Therefore, the maximum recoverable volume means the maximum amount of working sets we can use to train a muscle in a week that still allows it to recover. Fortunately, thanks to scientific studies, we have a pretty good idea of what this number is. One of the most clear studies was a review of literature done in 2022 by a team of researchers who looked at 7 studies which examined set volume and muscle hypertrophy. To simplify things, they put the trainees into groups: those who performed less than 12 working sets for a muscle every week, those that performed 12 to 20 working sets weekly for a muscle, and those that performed 20-plus working sets. They found that the 12 to 20 set group and the 20-plus set group produced significantly greater gains than those who did less than 12 sets. However, there was no significant difference between the 12 and 20 and the 20-plus set group. This means that after 20 sets, you'll likely start to see diminishing returns. Therefore, you should plan on performing 10 to 20 working sets to train each muscle. Awesome, so we do 20 sets of pull-ups. Well, no. It's probably pretty obvious, but you shouldn't use just one exercise for all your sets. We've all heard that variety is the spice of life, and as it turns out, variety is also the spice of your lifting life. Here's why. It has to do with the phenomenon seen to occur within the growth of a muscle. If you're like most people, you probably assume a muscle is a muscle and will grow when it's activated. Well, it doesn't, at least not homogeneously or in a uniform manner. We need to remember that a muscle is not a single solid piece of tissue. Rather, it's a collection of smaller fibers that are all bundled together in various formations and held tightly together, kind of like a rope. At that same time, the entirety of a muscle does not have the same exact endpoints, known as the origin and the insertion. The origin of a muscle is where it attaches to the bone that remains stationary, the non-moving part. The insertion is the part of the muscle that's attached to the bone that's actually pulling the limb. Since variations can occur within the same muscle, distinct regions of the muscle will exert varying forces and experience greater strain during different movements. For these reasons, researchers have discovered that the entirety of a muscle will actually not grow uniformly when worked with a single exercise. This non-uniform growth in the muscle actually manifests in a few different ways. One area where uneven growth occurs are in the different heads of the muscle. Remember before when we talked about the origin and the insertion of a muscle? Well, many muscles will have several different origins. The muscle bellies from these origins all then run down to the bone and eventually merge into one spot. A muscle belly is the fleshy contractile part of the muscle responsible for generating force. As they then travel to the bottom of the bone, they merge into one tendon for insertion. These heads are often of different length, width, and may even be composed of different size muscle fibers. Further, they may travel at different angles depending on their origin. For example, your biceps have 2 heads, a short head and a long head. Your triceps has 3 heads, medial, lateral, and long head, while your quadriceps have 4 heads. While all these muscles will contract to perform a primary movement, each head will have a slightly different special job. For example, the posterior deltoid performs shoulder extension, or bringing the arm backward, while the anterior deltoid flexes the shoulder, bringing the arm forward. However, along with the lateral deltoid, they'll all contract to drive the arm abduction along the frontal plane. In addition, these muscles are activated differently depending on the angle of force put on it. For example, this study found that 12 different variations of the bench press made by altering the grip and bench angle hit the 3 heads of the pectoralis major differently. That is, different combinations of the bench press placed more or less growth on the different heads. What this means in application is that if you were to only choose one combination, you may get amazing growth for one of the heads, while the others would fall back. Still, while many people are somewhat aware of the idea of training the different heads of a muscle, it gets a bit more complicated since it seems that just about every region of every head can experience difference in growth. There was a large review from 2000 that researched the growth in muscle fibers, and the entire review was dedicated to looking at non-uniformity of muscle growth. In it, they looked at a study from 1996 that used 6 months to train the quadriceps with knee extensions. After that 6 months, the researchers found significant differences in growth of the 4 heads. When measuring the cross-sectional area of the quadriceps as a whole, the researchers found that the proximal region, those closest to the body, and the distal regions, those parts furthest from the body, increased by 19%, while the central region only increased by 13%. They also found that the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris showed the greatest hypertrophy in the distal region, while the vastus intermedius and the medialis muscles showed greater hypertrophy in the proximal region. So basically, different regions of the 4 heads all saw different amounts of growth, and in fact, the review mentions that even single muscle fibers grow differently. Luckily, there have been studies that look at the results of using multiple exercises versus single exercises in a training program on muscle growth, such as a 2014 study where the researchers wanted to see what happens if you use just one exercise or multiple exercises to train the quads. The single exercises consisted of the squat, while the multiple exercise group trained the squat, leg press, deadlift, and lunge. The results were quite interesting. They found that both groups produced similar growth in the cross-section area of the quads. However, there's always nuance. When measuring the growth of the 4 heads of the quadriceps, they all saw even growth with the 4 exercises. On the other hand, the squat-only group only saw significant growth in the vastus lateralis and the vastus intermedius, while the rector femoris and the vastus medialis did not exhibit substantial increases in growth. That's to say, using multiple exercises produced more uniform growth, while a single exercise resulted in lopsided growth. In theory, this would result in greater overall muscle growth over time, as well as better aesthetics. The review concludes saying it would be advisable for bodybuilders to engage in different exercises to induce hypertrophy of different regions of a muscle, and that using multiple exercises to train a muscle should be an integral part of a training program. The problem is it doesn't make suggestions on how many. It seems it would make sense to use a separate exercise to specifically hit each head of every muscle. However, we only have a fixed amount of sets. Should we do 20 different exercises with only 1 set each, or is doing 5 different exercises with 4 sets better? Actually, again, we have a pretty good answer. Back in 2010, a meta-analysis was performed that compared the effects of a single set and multiple sets on muscle hypertrophy. The entire meta-analysis reviewed 8 studies to assess if any dose response existed with increased working sets. While they found that there was a positive trend toward more sets per exercise, no significant difference was found between 2 to 3 sets per exercise and 4 to 6 sets per exercise. And this was true for both trained and untrained individuals. One thing should be noted though, during the time of the study, there was a limited number of other studies that used 4 to 6 sets per exercise. Therefore, while there was a small positive trend associated with 4 to 6 sets, there simply weren't enough studies to become statistically significant. At that same time, a study from 2017 looked at the same question but specifically with upper body exercises. In it, they concluded that high sets of 3 or more aren't significantly better than 1 to 2 sets in untrained men. And in trained men, there are insufficient studies to make a conclusion. Therefore, it seems that when training a muscle for hypertrophy, 2 to 3 sets is probably sufficient, while 4 may have additional benefits. But we know that variation does, so stick to the 2 to 3 sets. And while we're talking about the number of exercises, we also need to acknowledge another very important factor: exercise selection. The exercises you choose are just as important as the number of exercises, possibly even more important. So let's examine the functionality of different exercises by looking at the biomechanics involved. Many of our different muscles actually cross not just one joint but 2. This means flexing 2 joints can work the same muscle but with entirely different biomechanics. For example, hamstrings cross the knee joint and the hip joint on the posterior section, while the quadriceps cross the knee and the hips on the anterior. In addition, both the triceps and the biceps cross the elbow and shoulder joint. To ensure you maximally hit each muscle, you need to be sure to hit it with exercises that mimic its function. So in order to fully hit the hamstrings, you need to use an exercise that utilizes knee flexion, such as leg curls. However, as the hamstring crosses the hips, you also need to use a hip hinge movement, such as Romanian deadlifts. Now let's look at the biceps in more detail. Have you ever realized that when you do a curl, your elbow tends to come forward? This is because the long head actually crosses the shoulder joint and assists in elbow flexion when the arm lifts up in front of the body. This is what makes the Bayesian curl a favorite exercise for smart lifters. The Bayesian curl has you perform a single arm cable curl while looking away from the weight, which pulls your arm back. When you perform the curl, you drag your elbow forward with shoulder flexion while doing the curl. Other exercises could also include incline curls. Let's use the brachialis as another example. If you want bigger arms, it's vital you train the brachialis as it runs underneath the belly of the biceps muscle. Even though you can't see it, growing it will still require more space in the arm, causing it to expand. So, how do we train it? Well, let's look at its anatomy and its function. When looking at the function of the biceps, it's responsible for supination of the forearm and flexing of the elbow, but only in a supinated position, that is, palms up. In contrast, the brachialis has only one job to do: flex the elbow, and this occurs in every position. Knowing this, we know that the best way to enlarge this muscle is by using a neutral grip, such as a hammer curl, or a pronated grip that's palms down, such as a reverse curl. This mitigates the biceps and puts the majority of the stress on the brachialis. Again, the point is that exercise selection is just as important as the number of exercises we use to train the muscle, if not more. Using 3 strategically selected exercises will be better than 4 or 5 random ones. Also realize that every exercise doesn't need to be a completely new exercise. Rather, you can simply make alterations to the movement. For example, using different grips like we saw in the chest study, as well as the discussion on the biceps and the brachialis. Also, putting the body at different angles will alter muscle activation. For example, many leg press machines have a backrest that allows you to adjust the angle. Sitting with the backrest more upright, similar to sitting in a chair, will cause greater flexion in your hips. This greater amount of hip flexion will require more involvement of the hamstrings muscle. On the other hand, leaning back more creates less flexion in the hips. This will decrease the involvement of the hamstrings and place a greater percentage of force on the quadriceps, as knee extension will become the more dominant movement. Even different foot placement can cause differences in activation. And again, remember the bench press study. The main point is you don't necessarily need a completely different exercise in your repertoire. You just need to make the correct alterations. Okay, so how do we apply everything we learned from these studies to our real life? The problem is that even with what we know, there's no clear-cut guide that tells us how many exercises we need to perform. But we can use all the information to make an educated guess. Let's first remember that a muscle should be hit with 10 to 20 sets per week. Now let's assume you train your muscle twice a week. Multiple studies have found twice a week to be the optimal training frequency, which you should train a muscle. That means that the muscle should be hit with 5 to 10 sets per session. We also know that each exercise should use 2 to 3 sets per exercise. This seems to be where the threshold for hypertrophy lies, since as you recall, once you start doing more, you start to see diminishing returns. While we could maybe use more sets, remember that variety is the key as far as hypertrophy is concerned. By sticking to smaller numbers of sets, we can utilize more exercises, aka more variety. So with that said, use 3 sets for your bigger primary exercises, while your smaller exercises could use 2. Therefore, you could train your large muscle groups with 2 to 4 exercises per session, 2 times a week. Keep in mind, the number of days a week you train can dictate this. Training 5 days versus 3 days gives you significantly more time. If you're trying to fulfill maximal sets per muscle group, you probably want to train 5 days a week, and we'll show you an example of a great program to use in just a moment. But first, one point to remember, while you can use 2 exercises that are biomechanically similar, they should be trained in different sessions. For example, let's say you're training your back. You could perform bent over rows in one session and the T-bar row or bent over row with an underhanded grip in the second. Now when it comes to your smaller muscles, specifically the biceps and triceps, there's a little more nuance. Keep in mind that your arms are trained during every single upper body compound movement. For example, the biceps are hit during pull-ups, while the triceps are hit with bench press. Therefore, they would only likely need an extra 10 sets of isolation work a week. That's max. This would equate to about 1 to 2 exercises a session. Again, that's a maximum. Further, your shoulders get hit a lot with every pushing and pulling exercise. Every type of horizontal movement trains the front deltoid, while every pulling exercise trains the rear deltoid. Therefore, they wouldn't need 3 to 4 shoulder-specific movements. They can also be good with around 10 specific sets a week. All in all, if we were to take everything into consideration, with a 5-day split, it would look something like this. Session 1, which targets the chest and back and consists of bench press, 3 sets of 5 reps or a 3x5, chin-ups 3x5, chest dips 3x8, T-bar row 3x8, barbell shrugs 3x10, cable fly 2x12, reverse fly 2x12, and face pull 2x12. Session 2 is all about the lower, so you'll do deadlift at a 3x5, front squat 3 sets of 6 reps, barbell good morning 3x8, machine hack squat 3x8, lying hamstring curl 2x12, leg extension 2 sets of 12 reps, calf raise 2x12, and finish with some core work. Session 3 hits the shoulders, chest, and arms. Military press 3 sets of 6 reps, incline dumbbell bench press 3x6, Arnold press 3x8, dumbbell pullover 3 sets of 10 reps, decline cable fly 2x10, rope upright row 2x10, hammer curl 2x12, overhead triceps extension with a rope 2x12. Session 4 is lower again, but with different exercises. So we have the back squat with 3 sets of 5 reps, Romanian deadlift with 3x5, split squat 3x8, hip thrust 3x8, leg extension 2x12, Nordic curl 2x5, standing calf raise 2x12, and some core work. And then session 5 is back, shoulders, and arms. Rack pull 3 sets of 5 reps, seated dumbbell overhead press 3x8, dumbbell row 3x8, lat pull down 3x8, lateral raises 2x10, face pull 2x10, easy curl 2x12, and triceps push down 2x12. There's one more factor to consider. You can swap out your exercises, or that's to say you should swap out your exercises. Swapping out your exercises gives you the ability to provide even more stimuli to your body to challenge it while also keeping things interesting. However, you don't want to swap out too often, as it will not allow you to properly apply progressive overload. Progressive overload is the idea that in order to see continuous muscle adaptations, such as size or strength, one must continually place a greater demand on the muscle over time. Therefore, swapping exercises weekly does not allow a lifter to improve upon their lift, as they're always changing what they do. Rather, you want enough time to become accustomed to the exercise and then improve upon it. Once you train the exercise for some time, your progress will begin to slow, and then you can swap. Unfortunately, there's no hard number for this, but generally a time period of 4 to 8 weeks is given. We would advise to use the longer period of 6 to 8 weeks for your larger compound exercises. On the other hand, your isolation exercises could be swapped every 4 weeks. Keep in mind, you can swap them all at once, or you could even just swap 1 per week. As we see, when it comes to exercises, there does seem to be some truth to more is better, at least in terms of variation. Therefore, your goal should be to utilize the largest variation of exercises within your ability to recover. Program them in a sensible manner so that you can apply progressive overload to them before any swapping. If you can do that, you'll have the optimal amount of exercises to maximize growth. What do deadlifts, squats, and leg press all have in common? We'll tell you in a second, but first let's talk about one of the most popular body parts people like to train, your glutes. Increasing the size of the derriere is extremely popular among gym goers, especially the ladies. It's easy to do since there are a ton of awesome glute exercises. However, it becomes a problem when people only want to grow their glutes but not their legs. Now we have a problem. So what do those first 3 exercises have in common? They're awesome glute exercises and you won't be doing them. Find out why as well as what exercises you should be doing in this video. Plus, we're going to even throw in some glute training hacks as well as a free program. In order to train your glutes without hitting your legs and get optimal results, there are a few bits of information you must know. First, you need to know what exercises you should use. You also need to know which ones not to use. You'll then need to know how to use these exercises, for example, what weight to use and how many reps. You'll also need to know the key training variable to bigger glutes. We're going to share this with you as it ties all of your training together. We'll throw a few hacks throughout the video as well. Because of the complexity of the glutes, all these parts are essential, and if you fail on any of them, you'll be stuck with either small glutes or big legs. Be sure to catch all of these so you can be successful on your journey to bigger glutes. Now let's start this process by discerning what exercises you should use. This is probably the trickiest part, as it will determine if your legs will grow or only your glutes. Therefore, we need to have a small anatomy and physiology lesson. We promise it'll be small, but knowing the function of your glutes is vital to training it properly. It will allow us to pick the best exercises to isolate them, as well as what exercises to steer clear of. Your glutes are actually made up of 3 muscles: the gluteus maximus, gluteus minimus, and gluteus medius. Together, they make up the strongest muscle group in the human body. They're situated on the back side of the body at the hips, between the lower back and upper part of the hamstrings. This makes it the literal link between the upper body and lower body. And we say link in the literal sense. Your glutes are part of a critical group of muscles collectively known as your posterior chain. Your posterior chain is a chain of muscles that runs down the posterior side of your body, the back side of it. It runs all the way from your neck all the way down to your feet. The muscle right above the glutes is known as the erector spinae, commonly known as your lower back, and beneath the glutes are your hamstrings. In this format, your posterior chain acts as a flexible support system for the body with your glutes as the pivotal muscle. Due to this centric location, your glutes are involved in just about every single movement you do throughout the day. They're the literal powerhouse of the body. Because your glutes are involved in so many movements, there are a lot of great exercises to train them. At the same time, their involvement in everything makes it difficult to isolate them. Seriously, they're always interacting with other muscles. This is going to limit the amount of exercises you can do, and all the usual suspects are off the list. But before we decide what ones we want to do, let's take a closer look at the glutes function. One of the primary functions of the glutes is to extend the hips. This occurs when your hips are flexed and must return to the erect position. Further, this flexion can occur in 3 positions. The first is when the torso is bent over and must be pulled back to an erect position. Think about a back extension for this movement. The second is when the hip is flexed but only the legs are forward and must be pulled back. A good example is when you're walking, your leg goes forward, plants on the ground, then drives the body forward. The third is when both your legs and torso are flexed forward like in a deadlift. In all of the movement patterns, the glutes are the primary driver. This is why exercises like deadlifts and Romanian deadlifts are commonly used to train the glutes. So, should you use them? No! At least these deadlift variations. Yes, they train your glutes, but they also train your hamstrings. There are some good deadlift variations we'll go over later. Another very important job is hip abduction, or swinging your leg to the outside, away from the body. External rotation is another movement pattern similar to hip abduction. Think about being in the lower part of a squat position. Hip abduction is what's responsible for preventing your knees from falling inward and keeping them pushed out. Both of these movements might be okay, but there are a few variables you need to consider. But first, let's go over the exercises you can't do. Knowing these will be very important as many of your common go-to glute exercises aren't go-to anymore, especially the big ones. Right off the bat, we need to cut out all types of squats and lunges. This includes back squats, front squats, sissy squats, split squats, step-ups, dumbbell lunges, goblet squats, all of them. Even the leg press is a no-go. All of these squat exercises include knee flexion and extension. Some include a lot. What this means is that the quadriceps are going to be activated, making these a no-go. Another group of exercises are your hip hinges. Now, this group of exercises consists of some classics for the glutes: deadlift, Romanian deadlift, sumo deadlift. This also includes single leg variations of these, such as the single leg Romanian deadlift. By their definition, hip hinges involve the flexion and extension of your hips. While the hamstrings are primarily responsible for flexing the knee, they're also involved in hip extension, especially when there's a greater degree of hip flexion. Remember this, as it will be important for the exercises you should do. But what this means is that all of these premium glute exercises are off limits. Even the barbell hip thrust is up for question. Generally regarded as the best glute exercises, only certain people can use it. So keep watching to find if it's suitable for you. So now you're probably asking, then what can we do? Don't worry, there's still enough to keep you busy. First, you want to use exercises that don't have knee extension or very minimal amounts. If you do this, you will effectively take out the quadriceps. At the same time, you don't want an exercise that has a significant amount of hip flexion. Again, higher degrees of hip flexion will utilize the hamstrings. On the other hand, a less amount of flexion will have less hamstring involvement. Before we get into the green light exercises, we wanted to address two exercises that may be okay if you do them correctly. The first is the American deadlift. The American deadlift is very similar to the Romanian deadlift, or RDL, except there is more emphasis in hip extension at the top of the movement. In fact, the exercise is performed by actually ending with a slight posterior pelvic tilt, making it a more glute-centric exercise. However, as there is hip flexion, it can still recruit the hamstrings similar to the RDL. One way to mitigate the involvement of the hamstrings is to not allow the barbell to go below your knees. From here, it will be up to you to decide how much risk you want to take. Another movement which is in the maybe category are rack pulls. Rack pulls are basically deadlifts, but the bar starts from a raised position. It's this raised position which changes its appropriateness level for glute-only training when compared with the deadlift. Technically, you can do a rack pull from any position, from just 2 inches to above your knee. From a training perspective, this allows you to work on various sticking points in the movement or places that you're weakest at. However, for our situation, we want to adjust the height to mitigate the use of the hamstrings. So similar to our advice with the American deadlift, start with the barbell a few inches above your knees. This will mitigate the use of the hamstrings. You can also choose to end in a similar manner as the American deadlift. When you perform both, focus on driving your hips forward rather than pushing your legs down, which will activate your quads. So now let's get into exercises that will definitely be good for you, and we'll then explain who can use the hip thrust. The first is the glute bridge. These exercises look similar to the hip thrust. However, with a hip thrust, your back pivots on the back of a bench, increasing the range of motion in the hips, which also results in greater knee flexion. These two variables are what challenges the quadriceps and hamstrings. In comparison, the glute bridge has your back stay on the ground throughout the whole movement. This mitigates the range of motion in both your hips and knee, making it more glute-centric. It's also easily modifiable, making it easy to load. This makes it a great primary exercise when trying to isolate the glutes. When you perform them, concentrate on squeezing your glutes and thrusting them forward. You can also perform another variation, a raised feet glute bridge. Another hip extension movement is the cable pull-through. This is performed using the cable machine and a rope. You stand facing away from the machine and the cable going between your legs, where you hold with your hands. Allow the cable to pull your hips backwards and then powerfully extend your hips, concentrating on squeezing your glutes. Kickbacks are another great option. A kickback is performed by starting with a bent knee. You then drive the leg backward while simultaneously extending the knee. A good movement to think about is horse bucking. That's what you want to do. A great variation is a standing cable kickback. You will attach the cable to your ankle, then perform the same kickback motion. You can also perform this from the quadruped position. Back extensions are great, but you must train them properly. While you set up, be sure to have your feet flared out. This will mitigate use of the hamstrings. Reverse hypers are awesome movements to perform. Ideally, you have a reverse hyperextension machine at your gym. If not, you can do a variation by leaning over a box and doing a kickback with both feet. Two other great movement patterns are hip abduction and external rotation. As far as the gluteal muscles, these exercises are going to primarily target the medial glutes. These are the glutes on the side of your thighs. Because of this, you actually have a lot of options to train these. The first is a standing hip abduction exercise performed with a cable machine. Connect the cable to your ankle and swing your leg out to the side, keeping it straight. You can also use lying hip abduction using body weight or a band. This is done by laying down on your side and while keeping your leg extended, lifting your leg up. Another choice would be quadruped hip abduction external rotation. Get on your all fours and then lift a leg out to the side. Okay, so it might look a little like a dog peeing on a fire hydrant, but it's a great exercise for your glutes. Now, one of our favorite glute exercises are frog pumps. Frog pumps are performed by laying on the ground with your feet together and your hips open. From here, you then perform a glute bridge. As your legs are out to the side, it eliminates the involvement of the quadriceps and hamstrings and places all of the force on the glutes. And now for the hip thrust. Who can do them? Due to the biomechanics, it will unfortunately train the hamstrings and quadriceps. However, people's individual body structure can dictate to what degree they feel the movement in different muscle groups. Try them. If you feel it in your hamstrings or quadriceps, you need to try some other exercise. However, if you don't and are okay with a possible little leg growth, do them. So now that you know what exercises to use, let's go over some programming. We'll then put all this together with a free program. But first, a training hack. Use a mind-muscle connection. The mind-muscle connection is a method of training when you focus on the specific muscle you want to activate. This will increase activation of that particular muscle to a higher degree. What was once just a theory, thanks to sport researchers, we now know this is a real phenomenon. Using a mind-muscle connection will improve the training of the glutes while also helping to further isolate it. This is very important for the hip thrust. Now for the training variables. Of all variables that can affect glute growth, total volume is the most important. Training volume refers to the total amount of work that a muscle performs throughout the session or week. Researchers have built a well-established relationship that shows a dose response. This means that more volume results in more muscle growth. Therefore, in order to maximize growth in your glutes, you need to choose the training variables that maximize volume. If you don't, you sacrifice growth. The first variable is training frequency. Training frequency refers to how many times a week you will train the glutes. Will you train once, twice, even 3 times? Under normal situations, researchers believe that training a muscle twice a week produces the most growth with the greatest intensity. However, there's also reason to believe that training a muscle 3 times a week may even be better, at least for a short time. Therefore, you should train at least twice a week, 3 times if you're in a hurry to get bigger glutes. Another variable which can optimize muscle growth is your rep scheme. Your rep scheme refers to the number of reps and sets you perform a movement. Ultimately, you should use the entire rep scheme. This includes 1 to 15 reps. However, your glutes are always working, so using very high reps of 15 plus once in a while is beneficial. You'll see how this plays out with your program. That said, your ideal range for muscle growth is going to be a moderate amount of reps, from 8 to 12 reps. This range produces the most reps at a heavy enough load to produce maximal growth. Now it's time. We can now talk about the most critical component in your glute training. It's a principle known as progressive overload. Progressive overload states that for continual muscle growth to occur, it must consistently experience slightly greater work. This basically means that you need to lift slightly more every week if you want bigger glutes. By lifting more weight or doing more repetitions, you are sending a message to the body that it needs a bigger, stronger muscle to deal with the extra stress. In your case, you need to put more work on the glutes. To get your glutes to grow, this is what you need to do. On a weekly basis, increase the work performed with your exercises. For example, let's say that one week you perform the American deadlift with 100 pounds and perform 10 reps. This means that your total training volume that week would be 1,000 pounds. Now, if you keep lifting 1,000 pounds every week after, you'll sweat and burn some calories, but your glutes won't get any bigger. Therefore, the next week you're going to want to lift more than 1,000 pounds, maybe 1,050 or land at 1,100 pounds. This process continues on, and you will grow your glutes. Here we go, we promised you a free glute training program to grow your glutes while not building your legs. Here it is: American deadlift 4x8, raised feet glute bridge 4x8, frog pumps 3x10 to 12, rope pull through 3x10 to 12, standing cable kickback 3x12 to 15, standing cable hip abduction 3x12 to 15. Use this template 2 to 3 times a week and swap around exercises as needed for optimal glute growth. If there was one specific body part that you could lose fat from, where would it be? If you're like most people, you're probably going to say the stomach or thighs. Targeting these specific areas when losing fat is known as spot reduction. Spot reduction is exercising in such a manner to increase fat loss from a certain spot. Doing crunches to lose stomach fat is probably the most common practice. Unfortunately, this is nothing more than a dream, or is it? As with most things, there's a lot of nuance to dig through when answering this topic. Recently, there's been evidence that suggests it might just be a dream that can come true. While we can't say it will work, we won't say it won't work with what we know now. This video will investigate the nuance. Losing body fat in a specific spot has long been one of the hot topics in the fitness world. Does it happen? Is it possible? Well, there's plenty of products and programs that say it can. However, most professionals will tell you it can't. Perhaps the simplest way to think about it is to answer this question. Did you choose where you gained weight? As the pounds were piling on, were you able to guide some to your thighs, and then some to your belly, and then your neck? Of course not. No one ever asks if they can choose where they store fat, so why would we then ask if we can choose where we lose fat? When trying to guess where you will lose fat first, it's likely the place you gained it most recently. In other words, people will generally lose weight in the reverse order of where they gained it. This order is largely dependent on a person's individual genetics. For example, if your genetics make it easier to gain fat around the stomach as you gain weight, this will be the hardest place for you to lose weight. However, what makes losing fat from the abdominal region so difficult is actually the key to the possibility of spot reduction. We'll get into that later in the video. So how big of an effect does genetics play? Well, it's estimated that genetics is the primary variable that controls fat distribution, up to 60% to be exact. In addition, certain genetic mutations dictate where you store fat as well. For example, Cushing's syndrome causes high fatty deposits in the midsection face between the shoulders and upper back. Things like your sex also play a major role in where you store fat. Women tend to have higher fat deposits in the lower body, such as the thighs and glutes. In contrast, men tend to hold weight around the midsection significantly more than women. Actually, stubborn belly fat may be the key to spot reduction. We'll get into that later on in the video. But back to genetics. If genetics play such a major role, how can we even attempt spot reduction? Well, this is just one of the reasons why most will simply say it's wishful thinking. Merely asking about it immediately brands you as either a beginner or a scammer. However, is this an appropriate reaction? Not really. In reality, the idea isn't that crazy. In fact, the possibility of spot reduction has been put forward by many throughout the past. For example, Ancel Keys, the father of the Mediterranean diet, was a proponent of spot reduction, or at least the possibility of it. It's been noted by various leaders in the field of fitness that athletes tend to burn more fat in the body parts they use more. We're not saying this makes it true, rather we are simply suggesting that it's not as silly of an idea as you may first think. Now, before we go further with the theory of how fat loss occurs and how spot reduction might occur, let's first look at how fat is stored in the first place. When a person consumes food, the body will store the excess calories in of your two storages of energy. The first energy storage is in the form of glycogen, a form of glucose that's stored in your liver and muscles. In a fed state, this glycogen will come from your consumption of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are simply long chains of sugars, making it incredibly simple for the body to put it down into glycogen, a simple sugar. However, your glycogen stores are finite. Therefore, when they're full, they're full. This is why you have a second form of energy storage, your fat stores. Unlike your glycogen stores, your fat stores are almost unlimited, making it the largest amount of energy in your body. There's virtually no limit to it, which is what leads to obesity. The first obvious source of stored fat is from eating fats themselves. When you consume fats, these fats are broken down into triglycerides, which are then shuttled into your fat cells to be used upon later when energy is in demand. At the same time, if you continue eating carbohydrates when your glycogen stores are full, they can be converted into triglycerides to be stored as well. This is how eating too many carbs can make you fat. So now your glycogen stores are full and you have plenty of fat, both waiting to be used for energy. Pay attention to this next part as it will be important later on in the video. When the demand arises, your body will draw from both your glycogen stores as well as your fat stores to different degrees. When your glycogen stores are full, the body will draw from there, as converting glycogen to glucose is a one-step process. However, during times of prolonged exercise or fasting, the body will turn to your fat stores to a higher degree to ration the remaining glycogen, which is needed to power your brain. The triglycerides that were stored in the fat cells are released and go through a process known as gluconeogenesis, which converts the fats into usable glucose. This process produces leftover hydrogen and water as byproducts, which are then exhaled or expelled in fluid. If you stay in a caloric deficit, these stores will remain empty as there's no energy to refill them, and you lose weight. So let's back up for just a second to the part that triglycerides are released. This is where spot reduction comes into play. The primary thought is that fats are to be used through whole body release. The release of fats for energy is taken from the entire body, regardless of what body part is requiring the energy. Fat from your thighs will supply the same amount of energy as fat from your stomach. In other words, from an energy perspective, the body gets no benefit from drawing fat from a specific spot. Spot reduction says you can choose a specific spot to lose fat from. Even though this theory is scoffed at by many, there is actually a sound theory behind it. Proponents of its possibility suggest that spot reduction might work by training a muscle that's near the desired area of fat loss. This could occur by increasing the temperature near the area and increasing blood flow, which may promote lipolysis, or the breakdown of fat. So what does increased blood flow have to do with fat loss? Remember when we spoke about your fat cells holding triglycerides and will release them upon necessity to be used for energy? Well, the interesting thing is these fats aren't soluble in water the slightest. Therefore, their transport to and from tissue requires specialized transport mechanisms and adequate blood flow. In other words, poor blood flow will result in less mobilization of fat stores. On the contrary, more blood flow will increase the ability for fats to mobilize. Remember at the beginning of the video when we talked about belly fat? One of the reasons that makes belly fat so hard to get rid of is the abdominal region experiences significantly less blood flow when compared to other body parts such as your arms and legs. We do know that certain tactics can increase fat lipolysis in general. For example, taking caffeine has been shown to blunt the use of carbs for energy while promoting the use of fats. However, the mobilization of fats occurs in a more generalized manner rather than specific area. In addition, there is some evidence that certain topical creams do actually work, specifically a cream using a compound known as aminophyllene. Aminophyllene works by lowering the lipolytic threshold. Basically, it makes the breakdown of fats easier to do. For example, a study looked at the effects that aminophyllene cream had on the waist circumference of 50 men and women that were classified as overweight. The researchers reported a significant reduction in waist circumference compared to the placebo group with no adverse events in either group. While working through different mechanisms, aminophyllene still works by increasing the ease of fat breakdown. It seems this is one of the keys for spot reduction. While the body will release fat from everywhere, it will favor the path of least resistance. The primary way spot reduction has been attempted in the past is to perform extra resistance training in the desired area or body part. The best example is using crunches in an attempt to lose fat in the abdominal region. In fact, this is such a common tactic that there has been research to look at its effectiveness or lack thereof. One such study had 40 overweight and obese women follow a diet only for 12 weeks, or follow a diet while following an abdominal resistance training plan for 12 weeks. Multiple measurements were taken before and after the study, including waist and hip circumferences, abdominal skin folds, abdominal subcutaneous fat thickness by way of ultrasonography, and body fat percent through using a bioelectric impedance device. The researchers found that both groups lost similar amounts of weight. However, there was no major difference in any of the variables. In other words, the extra abdominal training had no effect on waist circumference or the amount of subcutaneous fat thickness. In 2022, a meta-analysis was conducted that examined the effect of resistance training on localized fat reduction. A meta-analysis will look at and compare all of the studies on a certain subject to develop a single answer. In this case, it included 13 studies. Once all of the data was taken into account, the meta-analysis concluded that localized muscle training had no effect on localized adipose tissue deposits, i.e. there was no spot reduction, regardless of the characteristics of the population and of the exercise program. Things aren't looking good for spot reduction. In fact, it seems like maybe the naysayers are right. However, all hope isn't lost just yet. Maybe all of the evidence so far has shown no effect simply because they haven't been using the right protocols. This is what a group of researchers in 2023 proposed. The primary observation made regarding spot reduction is that people will use strength training to target the area where weight loss is desired. For example, someone doing Russian twists or crunches. However, it's not the specific exercise people perform, but rather the intensity they use. When the researchers said people traditionally used strength training, they were referring to the fact people used a greater load with fewer reps, in the same way you'd train a muscle when growth was your main goal. However, remember that the theory isn't that spot reduction works by gaining muscle, but rather by increasing temperature and blood flow. The researchers wanted to see what would happen if a person used an exercise and performed it in an aerobic fashion. That is, use a light load that can be performed for more than a couple minutes. For example, instead of using heavy dumbbells for bicep curls, maybe you grab a small set of 5-pound dumbbells, or maybe none at all, and perform curls for 3 minutes. In this study, a group of overweight individuals performed 27 minutes of running at 70% of max heart rate. This was then followed with 4x4-minute intervals of torso rotation using 30% to 40% of their 1 repetition max or 1 RM. This is a very light load that can be performed for extended periods of time. One side would train while the other side would rest. Then they performed 4x4-minute intervals at 30% to 40% of 1 RM in the abdominal crunch machine, interspersed with 3-minute active breaks at 20% of 1 RM. In contrast, the control group simply performed treadmill jogging at 70% of max heart rate for 45 minutes. After the study, the researchers discovered some interesting results. After 10 weeks of training, which included 40 training sessions, the aerobic abdominal training group lost more fat mass, 697 grams or 3% in the trunk. In contrast, the jogging-only group had no detectable loss. Why might this occur? Researchers aren't positive, but they believe due to the theory we've mentioned, increasing the temperature along with blood flow. In addition, the researchers suggest another mechanism as well. In the beginning of the video, we mentioned our body will first draw from its glycogen stores to fuel energy. However, when these stores run out, your body will use fat stores to convert into glucose. The researchers believe that the prolonged aerobic training depletes the nearby glycogen stores. In turn, the body mobilizes nearby fat stores to replenish the glycogen stores. However, this actually isn't the first study to use exercises in an aerobic fashion to research spot reduction. A study from 2013 used a similar study design but utilized leg extensions rather than core training to measure fat loss in the thigh. While the results showed a 5.1% decrease in fat, there was no difference in the trained body part compared to the rest of the body. This may be due to the fact that fat stored in the upper body is easier for the body to use for energy compared to the lower body. It also means we still have a lot we don't understand. Another study from 2021 also used endurance exercise but by way of circuit training. 18 volunteers, 9 female and 9 male, aged between 20 and 46 with 1+ year of training were split into 2 groups. Both groups performed a similar set of exercises that used both aerobic and resistance training exercises. However, the order of exercises and timing varied. The control group performed all of the aerobic exercises at the beginning of the session and then performed all of the resistance training exercises at the second part of the session. Further, the resistance training exercises utilized a traditional rep scheme, 1 exercise at a time, with a prescribed number of sets and reps. On the contrary, the experimental group performed a circuit first, rotating between one of 3 aerobic exercises, 5 minutes of either treadmill, bike, or stepper, ab crunches, and dumbbell overhead extension. For example, a participant would perform 5 minutes on the treadmill, then 20 crunches, 15 overhead triceps extension, 5 minutes on the bike, 20 crunches, and so on. It's important to note that the aerobic exercises were done at low intensity and performed at 65% of max HR. Once they finished the circuit, they performed the other resistance exercises in a traditional manner. The researchers found that the experimental group saw a significantly greater loss in the abdominal region, as well as the spinal erector. On the contrary, the traditional training group saw none. In addition, the experimental group also saw a greater loss of body mass. However, no difference was seen in the triceps in either group. The researchers had the same theory about blood flow and concluded the goal of spot reduction training should be to increase blood perfusion in the areas where it is most needed. Further, they cite evidence that suggests blood flow and lipolysis are generally higher in subcutaneous adipose tissue adjacent to contracting than adjacent to resting muscle irrespective of exercise intensity. In other words, both blood flow and lipolysis are greater in areas of fat near a working muscle. Think of it like this. Your body will follow a whole-body approach in terms of the release of fats. However, this release will be greater in those areas in which the release is easier. By performing exercise next to a muscle, you increase blood flow to that area, which will also increase the ability for fats to be released and transported. As of now, all the studies we have spoken about use traditional methods of exercise to study spot reduction. While the variables and methodology are different, they still use basic exercise. Enter technology. There are quite a few studies which suggest that using high-tech equipment changes the game a little bit. In fact, the majority of studies that show spot reduction is plausible in theory involve tech. For example, in 2018, researchers found the electrical stimulation of the abdominals resulted in a moderate reduction in waist circumference. In 2011, low laser therapy was shown to be an effective manner to selectively contour a body shape. And more recently, in 2023, the simultaneous emission of synchronized radio frequency and high-intensity focused electromagnetic energy, that's also the name of the study, was proven to be effective to reduce the size of fat deposits in local areas. Now you're probably thinking, so the only sure way for me to be successful at spot reduction is to go and spend an unknown amount of money on high-tech treatments. If so, let us say that no, we are not suggesting you go spend the money for these treatments. However, this doesn't mean these studies have no value. They do show that we can further influence where fat is released. It's by these studies which may help pave the way for a more practical and efficient method of spot reduction. By having a better understanding of what influences fat release, researchers may be able to produce a better training protocol, supplement, or even a more efficiently priced piece of equipment. If this little bit of research gives a glimmer of hope, how do we go about it? Well, this leaves us where we currently are with spot reduction. While there are studies that show us exercise can induce localized fat loss, the truth is it's lacking. Rather than attempt spot reduction, you may just be better off losing fat the old-fashioned way. Go for a general fat loss approach. However, assuming your spot reduction routine doesn't interrupt your regular training, it's not going to necessarily hurt you. The worst that will happen is you lose fat in a generalized manner, primarily from the extra calories burned during exercise rather than localized. So with this in mind, if you wanted to try and see what happens, this is what we would do. Let's remember that we have two studies that showed some promise. The first used an interval protocol while the other utilized a circuit protocol. Either one will present a practical issue with exercise selection we did not speak about. Let's say you are going to use a machine to perform a 4x4 interval. This means you'll need a machine you can use for 32+ minutes. Or let's say you're going to do a circuit, which will require you to perform an exercise every 5 minutes or so. Again, this requires the ability to have access to a particular machine or equipment for extended periods of time. Unless you have your own gym, taking up a single piece of equipment for this long would be frowned upon in a normal gym setting, limiting your options for exercising. But it can still be done. To hit the arms or back, purchasing a pair of light dumbbells or even resistance bands would work. For example, hitting the back of the arms, a common problem area, could be hit with some banded triceps pushdowns or overhead extensions. The back could be hit with some very light rows. For the core, depending on your strength, the plank may be a good choice, or perhaps Russian twists with no weight. Your goal is to be able to perform the exercise continuously for at least 2 minutes. Now, we saw two protocols, and it's impossible to say which one might be more effective. However, the main idea is to use both aerobic exercise and very low-intensity exercise. There's a countless amount of ways to set this up, but the general idea is the same. For example, you could cycle for 5 minutes, then perform Russian twists or planks for 2 minutes. Repeat for 4 to 6 rounds. One tactic could be to perform this after a regular training session, as your glycogen will already be depleted. Assuming the proposed theory is correct, this is ideal. We're going to be honest. This one surprised us. While spot reduction is often laughed at, it actually seems to not be so crazy of an idea. We have technology that can achieve it, as well as various training protocols specifically for the stomach. The main issue is we simply don't have enough information to be able to provide a definitive answer of doing it. The best we can do is make an informed guess. Regardless if it works, it's still going to be a lengthy process. This means that effective fat loss, either overall loss or spot reduction, is going to require patience and dedication. It's going to be up to you for it to work, so if you're ready to drop some weight, try using the tactics in this video. All in all, the worst that could happen is you lose weight everywhere rather than a specific spot. We can live with that. Do you want to live longer, live with less disease, and have a better sense of self-worth? These are just a few of the benefits that are said to be the result of fasting. Yep, all that from simply not eating. Most people are only aware of its effect on fat loss and weight maintenance, which is also a must for a healthy lifestyle. Around the world, obesity has been steadily growing at an increasing rate. The CDC quotes a startling number of 41.9% for obesity prevalence in the USA. As such, everyone's trying different diets to lose weight, including fasting. In this video, we're going to look at exactly what happens to your body during a fast, including its amazing benefits. While weight loss is one, you probably aren't aware of the other one. Continue watching to find out. Before we talk about fasting, we need to define it. In its simplest definition, fasting is the abstention from eating, drinking liquids with calories, and sometimes drinking altogether. This simple definition would imply that we're always fasting so long as we're not eating. This is pretty much all day. This doesn't really describe what fasting is. Therefore, some state that a period of fasting officially begins 3 to 5 hours after your meal, as that's how long it takes for your last meal to be fully digested and absorbed. Still, even with this definition, we fast every day. Well, at least an overnight fast. The first meal of the day is called breakfast or break fast. It's when our body comes out of this daily overnight fast with the first food of the day and breaks the fast. Still, others will say a fast begins when physiological changes begin to occur. From this perspective, a fast could be said to begin 12 hours after your last meal. This is when a metabolic shift takes place in most individuals. We'll talk more about that later on in the video. While the exact time a quote fast begins is up for discussion, we do know that refraining from eating has been around for a long time. Although fasting has hit the fitness community only recently, it's actually been a part of mankind's history since the beginning. When humans fasted originally, it was due to having no choice in the matter. Before humans developed agriculture and cultivated livestock, they practiced a foraging lifestyle and did not get to choose when they would eat their meals. In fact, fasting has been practiced in this manner for much of mankind's history, as agriculture has only been around for 12,000 years. Therefore, it's believed that many of the first post-agricultural communities practiced fasting as their bodies were already adapted to it, and continuous eating could have been seen as strange. For example, the early Romans believed that eating more than one large meal a day led to sickness. In addition, many of the early religions practiced fasting in some manner as a religious practice, often as a way to deny the body's physical needs in order to focus on its higher deity. This went on until the 1800s, when overeating was becoming recognized as an unhealthy lifestyle practice and possibly responsible for many diseases, a view particularly believed by an American physician, Edward Dewey, who believed every disease was caused by overeating. In the 1900s, German physician Otto Buchinger became the first to study and note the health benefits of fasting, saying, "Fasting is, without any doubt, the most effective biological method of treatment." In the 2000s, the Italian biogerontologist and fasting researcher Walter Longo noted that fasting has numerous significant benefits that lead to both an extended lifespan and an extended health span. Even with these proponents and a growing base of supporting research that testifies to the health benefits of fasting, it can still be looked at with uncertainty by the public. This is primarily because many people simply don't understand what actually happens during fasting, except you get hungry. Still, even what is largely misunderstood as hunger is not reported nearly as much as you might think. This lack of hunger is just one of the things we'll look into in this video as we look at what's going on physiologically during a 3-day fast. Let's get into what happens when you put the fork and knife down. After you eat your meal, your food is broken down, including your carbohydrates, which initially causes a spike in your blood glucose levels. Initially, these blood glucose levels are what's used to supply energy and maintain function. However, as time progresses longer and longer after you eat, your blood glucose levels will begin to drop. In order to maintain functional blood glucose levels, glycogen, which is basically a stored version of glucose, will begin to break down. This is done through a process known as glycogenolysis in order to supply extra glucose during times of fasting. As you go farther, your glycogen levels will begin to drop lower and lower. This will force your body to turn to non-carbohydrate sources, namely fats and proteins, to convert to glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. Then your body will turn to ketosis, the production of ketones for energy. We'll look at this process in greater detail below. But rather than rely on glucose, your body will then use these ketones for energy. In addition, this will spare the glucose that's produced to fuel red blood cells and the brain, which require glucose to function. Regardless, this whole process provides a very important benefit: the lowering and stabilization of blood glucose levels and the increase of sensitivity to insulin. With over 10% of the US population suffering from diabetes, fasting could make a massive impact on the country's health. Small studies on patients with diabetes have even shown that fasting can be effective for weight loss in those with type 2 diabetes while decreasing the need for insulin. Now, the same process that results in the stabilization of blood glucose and sensitivity to insulin also has another profound effect. In fact, from a fitness and performance perspective, this may be the most profound effect of fasting: a metabolic shift in the production of energy. We just went through the basics of this process but only touched on the stabilization of glucose. Now we'll go through it again in detail in terms of its effect on the metabolism of energy. With the rise in keto, many people in the fitness industry are familiar with the concept of becoming fat-adapted, or your body utilizing fatty-free acids for energy. But what does this mean? Well, the term fat-adapted can be a bit of a misnomer, as many may take this to mean your body doesn't usually use fat. It does, but it uses carbohydrates as its preferred source of glucose production under normal eating conditions. As carbohydrates are essentially just strands of sugars, breaking them down is a relatively simple process. They'll be broken down into glucose and sent directly to the bloodstream, or glycogen to be stored for later use. However, as mentioned before, your body can also convert fat or protein into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis, the synthesis of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. As you could guess, this is a much more complicated process, as it must completely transform compounds. Therefore, under normal eating conditions, your body has two sources to produce glucose: carbs in the form of stored glycogen, or fatty acids from stored fat. Under normal conditions, your body will use both of these sources for fuel. What's different is the varying degrees it'll rely on one or the other. Depending on individual factors and activity levels, under normal conditions, your body may get 50 to 70% of its energy requirements from carbs, while getting 30 to 50% of its energy requirements from fat. However, as your fasting time lengthens, your stored glycogen will begin to be converted into glucose more and more. The problem with this is that there is a finite supply of glycogen. Therefore, as the fast continues, your levels of glycogen will drop lower and lower, as you aren't replenishing it with food. As this occurs, your body will start to alter the ratio of where it gets its glucose from. In order to spare glycogen, your body will begin to break down fat to a greater extent. However, as of now, keep in mind that the fat must still be converted into glucose to utilize. This greater reliance on fats for the production of glucose is what occurs during the initial stages of fasting. The length of time for this stage can vary depending on the original baseline glycogen levels as well as your activity levels. As a result, it can last anywhere from 12 to 36 hours. First-time fasters generally take longer to pass through this first stage, while experienced fasters tend to take a shorter time in this phase. Now, as you continue with your fast, the levels of glycogen within the body are heavily depleted. At this time, fatty acids and glycerol are then produced in an accelerated fashion and sent into the bloodstream to head for the liver. It's at the liver where they produce compounds known as ketones. Remember them? These ketones are unique, as they're also able to act as an alternative source of energy. To be clear, they are not converted into glucose first. Rather, these ketones are sent to tissue to be used directly. It's at this moment when you've become fat adapted. Your body has transitioned from utilizing glucose for energy to ketones for energy. As you could have guessed, this is where the keto diet comes from, except they reach this metabolic shift merely by limiting carb consumption to a minimum. The point is that this metabolic shift is a significant change to the body's physiological system, and it's truly a testament to how magnificent the human body is. Another magnificent adaptation to fasting is a process known as autophagy. Autophagy is your body's waste and renewal system. It's a process by which cells break down so that damaged or dysfunctional components can be removed. These are then replaced with healthy components to maintain a fully functional cell and maintain homeostasis. The process of autophagy can be triggered by a number of different factors, fasting being one of them. During fasting, insulin levels drop, and the body starts to use stored energy such as glycogen and fat for fuel. This shift in energy metabolism may activate autophagy to recycle cellular components and generate the amino acids and fatty acids needed for energy production. Now, where this becomes especially important is with an increase in longevity. Fasting or prolonged calorie restriction has long been associated with an increase in life. As autophagy gets rid of sick cells and replaces them with healthy cells, it makes sense that these individuals with a higher rate of autophagy will have longer lives with less disease as well. In fact, researchers now believe that the autophagy triggered by fasting is primarily responsible for its effect on longevity. Upon fasting, increases in rates of autophagy have been found in just about every organ and tissue, including the heart, liver, kidneys, and muscles. Still, autophagy has been found to work on neurons, which acts as a key mechanism for the prevention of malignancy, infection, and neurodegenerative diseases, as well as in slowing aging. The exact amount of time needed to trigger autophagy is unclear. For example, some studies suggest that merely breaking down your total calories into 2 meals a day is enough. To be clear, if you eat 3,000 calories a day, you would eat 2 meals of 1,500 calories. Other research has shown that simple intermittent fasting is enough to offer positive benefits to cancer patients. So while we don't know the exact time frame and mechanisms, we can be pretty confident telling you that 3 days is more than enough time. So now let's move on to a more obvious adaptation. If you're not eating, you gotta lose weight, right? you do. In fact, apart from religious or political reasons, weight loss, or the maintenance of weight, is one of the more common reasons someone might partake in a regular fast. Researchers have discovered that during the initial phases of a fast, there's a rapid loss of weight. In fact, the weight loss is significantly higher than one would expect just from comparing calories burned versus calories consumed. For example, a case study followed a man who ran a 36-day fast while attempting a 40-day fast for religious purposes. During the fasting period, he only consumed a total of 60 calories a day for communion and only drank water. With a starting weight of 68.6 kilograms, he lost a total of 15.7 kilograms during the fast. However, the drop in weight did not occur evenly. During the first 5 days, he lost an average of 0.9 kilograms a day. This then gradually dropped for the next until it evened out at 0.3 kilograms a day. What's interesting is that 0.9 kilograms would require a caloric deficit of 3,150 calories. However, his basal energy expenditure was only 1,673 calories. These are the calories your body burns to support life functions such as thinking and respiratory function. While the man wasn't bedbound, he didn't even come close to burning 1,500 extra calories. So what happened? Well, it's established that this rapid drop is due to the result of salt and water diuresis. Further, a drop in total muscle glycogen will likely also play a role as well. It's important to keep this in mind as you may drop 3 kilos in 3 days. However, maybe only half of that is actually body weight, while the rest will be gained back by eating. Losing weight is obviously a big plus for many people. Still, there's a more curious adaptation going on behind the scenes. Well, actually, in your head. Fasting has just as much effect on the physical as it does the mental side. One of the more unique aspects of prolonged fasting is an increase in not only satiety, but well-being as well. This sense of euphoria is what has led some to attach fasting to a spiritual aspect. Regardless, it is widely reported, very widely. Reports have estimated that 93.2% of participants in prolonged fasting report an increase in physical and emotional well-being, as well as an absence of hunger feelings. The researchers report that an absence of hunger often shocked the individuals, as fear of hunger is often a deterring factor to fasting. One large study monitored a group of individuals who partook in a fasting protocol for 4 to 21 days. During their individual fasting periods, all the participants saw a gradual increase in emotional well-being and personal well-being until the end of their fast. What's interesting is that those who started with a lower baseline tended to choose to fast for longer periods. Regardless, at the end of their session, all protocols resulted in the same level of increased well-being. This increase in well-being has a variety of mechanisms that are thought to play a role. For example, fasting seems to cause the production of endogenous opioids. In addition, the glucose to ketose switch also leads to cognition, mood, motor, and autonomic nervous system function, which increases well-being. It also increases the production of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. BDNF plays many roles and is often associated with neurogenesis and neuronal protection. Further, it's been shown to enhance the growth and survival of serotonin neurons. Speaking of BDNF, it plays yet another role in fasting. Anecdotally, a very common report after prolonged fasting is clearer thinking or sharper thought process results. We now have a better understanding as to why. A fact of life is that as we age, our bodies deteriorate, including our brains. This process can lead one to develop a number of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, or general dementia. Aging of the brain can also lead to a greater chance of experiencing a stroke. Unfortunately, research has now shown that this process can be exacerbated by living a sedentary lifestyle as well as consistently eating a surplus of calories. However, we now also know several ways to combat this deterioration, such as being involved in exercise throughout your life. In addition, challenging the body metabolically has also been found to maintain healthy brain function. One of these mechanisms is through the production of proteins, bringing about metabolic challenges that are involved in synaptic plasticity, neurogenesis, neuronal survival, memory, and learning. Of all of these proteins, the one we just spoke about is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. As we age, this protein sees a steady loss in sedentary persons, which is coupled with a degradation of cognitive performance. Research has shown that its decrease is accompanied by a reduction in synaptic plasticity, memory, and learning, as well as an increased risk of cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. And this is where fasting comes into play. Various fasting methods, such as intermittent fasting, have been found to upregulate BDNF and improve cognitive performance. Yet another positive effect fasting has on brain health is through the gut biome. Research has shown that IF changes the composition of the gut microbiota to favor brain health. While these benefits to the brain are awesome, you aren't going to reap the benefits from one 3-day fast. Rather, you should run 3-day fasts periodically. We should also mention that fasting has the ability to both prevent neurodegenerative diseases and the onset of dementia, as well as treat these impairments. As such, if you have a fully healthy brain, you may not see or feel benefits as you already are at your threshold for a healthy brain. However, just because you may not notice improvements, you can rest assured that fasting will keep your brain healthy. With that said, when it comes to acute effects, some studies showed there might be a slight decrease in cognition tasks such as reaction. This seems to occur after 24 hours, but may only be present during the transition period. At the same time, studies are inconclusive, so the exact causes are unknown, but the level of experience likely plays a role. While your brain is benefiting from fasting, we're now going to look at its effect on your endocrine system. Human growth hormone, or HGH, is a powerful peptide hormone that plays a crucial role in growth, development, and overall metabolic function. Due to its vast array of functions, it works through several mechanisms. During fasting, HGH promotes the breakdown of fat, lipolysis, and the release of fatty acids for energy. As this is a primary mechanism of fasting, it stands to reason that human growth hormone will increase during a 3-day fast. Actually, it doesn't even need 3 days. Studies have found that HGH can increase in just 2 days of fasting. Now, you could be thinking, but what about the potential adverse effects? Does it pose any harm to individuals? The truth is, it does happen, but perhaps not as much as you might expect. For example, one study looked at over 1,300 persons who followed what's known as the Buchinger-Wilhelmi fast. It's a fasting protocol that only allows 150 to 200 calories per day. During this period, there were fortunately no deaths or permanent effects. However, there were 2 hospitalizations: an elderly man with coronary artery disease who had a myocardial infarction, and a 67-year-old woman who experienced vomiting, diarrhea, and dizziness. Other than that, the most common disorders were sleep disturbances, seen by 14.94% of patients, fatigue by 13.7%, dry mouth by 8.84%, back pain by 7.43%, and hunger affecting 6.81%. In total, there were 22 mild symptoms and 8 different serious side effects. So, as you might imagine, fasting does carry some potential adverse effects, so it's not something to take lightly. However, with some preparation and planning, the risk of a serious event is quite small. Although we went through quite a few major physiological changes and adaptations in this video, it's still not all of them. Energy metabolism is one of the most important processes in the human body, and by fasting, you're creating an entirely new environment that forces your body to alter it completely. That's going to have a profound effect. It's probably safe to say that fasting will have an effect to some magnitude on just about every system. For example, we also have research to show that fasting has positive effects on the immune system as well as your cardiorespiratory system. As more and more research is done, it'll give researchers the ability to discover even more benefits. So now that you know what's going to happen to your body after not eating for 3 days, do you want to give it a shot? Now slow down there for a second. Going 72 hours without eating is not something to take lightly. If you've never fasted before, the longest you've probably ever gone without eating is 12 hours. Maybe 24 on accident one time. That would mean 72 hours is 3 to 6 times longer. Even though studies have shown that doing prolonged fasts is relatively safe, they do bring some health risks, as we saw. Therefore, think about it as lifting weights. Even though lifting is relatively safe, you don't just jump on your first day with a 5-hour session, including huge 1-rep max tests on all your barbell lifts. Rather, you ease into it. Therefore, before you do a 72-hour fast, begin with a shorter duration. The easiest option is intermittent fasting, or IF. IF is a method of fasting that alternates short blocks of time for feeding and long blocks of fasting. For example, you could start with an 8-hour block where you're allowed to consume food, followed by a 16-hour block of time for fasting. You could then gradually lengthen the block of fasting until you're left with just 1 meal a day, or OMAD. From there, you can move on to a full 24-hour fast, and so on. Another tip to prepare for longer fasts is to consume calories, but only in liquid form. This can help adapt to the sensation of not eating. In addition, you can practice by consuming a minimal amount of calories. For example, for your first 3-day fast, consume just 1,000 calories per day. On your next one, consume 750 calories, and then so on. Slowly adjust to fasting for longer periods of time. As you can see, there are multiple methods you can use. If you choose to try fasting, we wish you success and only ask that you perform a fast that you're safely able to do. And let us know how it went. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon and Dan was doing his usual thing, spending his time on the couch flipping around from game to game. As he was getting real comfy, he started to doze off when it happened. This commercial came on, a commercial for the brand new T3000 turbo motorcycle. He'd always dreamed of owning this bike. Cruising around America, just him and the open road, thoughts began running through his head about all the adventures he'd have and the places he could go. He could almost feel the wind in his hair when all of a sudden his dream came crashing down. For the low price of $35,000. He's not sure who on earth thinks that's low, but it's certainly not him. There's no way he could afford that. At least I have my dreams. But as fate would have it, an opportunity came on the television. An opportunity to win that bike. A brand new gym was opening up in town. To increase their membership and raise awareness on health, they were running a contest. A really big contest. How much weight can you lose in a year? At first, Dan thought that was pretty extreme. A year? That's a big commitment. Well, this was not an accident, as the gym knew what they were doing, as Dan would find out later. In reality, it had been a while since Dan had ever been to the gym. It's been a long while. Actually, the more he thought about it, and if he was being honest, Dan had never been to a gym. Ever. Sure, when he was a kid, he played the usual pickup games of basketball and would throw the ball around once in a while, but he never really took his fitness that seriously. As he grew older, life did what life does and began putting all of the usual stresses on him. You know, work, family, work, social life, domestic chores, a little more work. All of this had taken a toll on his health, and by health we mean he gained weight. He had seen a video from the TWS channel and heard all about what can happen if one has too much extra weight. Higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and even cancer. It seemed that high body fat resulted in an increase in every disease. However, that still never motivated him. And then the commercial announced the winning prize, a free 1-year membership and $35,000. This was a chance for getting the bike of his dreams. Rubbing his ever-growing belly, he knew this was a real chance to get fit and win his bike. Like many people, Dan has the desire to lose weight. Some do it to look better, some do it for health reasons, and some people do it to win a bike. Actually, Dan is probably the only person to lose weight just to win a bike. Regardless of the reason, losing weight for a year is an aspirational goal. As a newbie, there is a lot that Dan is going to need to learn if he wants to optimize his total weight loss. There are so many different variables that could affect his total loss. His training, nutrition, and sleep. These are just a few areas he will need to change if he wants to get his bike. However, if he gets it right, Dan could lose a considerable amount over the next 365 days. How much? We'll look at his journey to see what he learns, mistakes he makes, and where he gets it right. Heck, there's even a possibility he could throw in the towel and gain weight. Unfortunately, this is a not-so-uncommon occurrence. But Dan was motivated. With high hopes in store, he pulled into the gym to find the parking lot full. The only parking spot that was open was all the way back, on the opposite of the gym. Obviously annoyed, Dan would begrudgingly take the spot and began his long walk to the gym, huffing under his breath. This was the first sign that Dan did not fully understand weight loss. He also didn't comprehend how much work he was going to need to do to lose weight for the $35,000. Too often, new weight loss trainees can think that weight loss is something that walking across the parking lot contributes to something called NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. NEAT is basically the calories that we burn from activity that is not exercise. This can be things like washing your dog, making dinner, and walking across a parking lot. Many people losing weight, like Dan, made the mistake by overlooking this for extra calories burned and only focusing on exercise for burning calories. He doesn't know it yet, but he'll learn just how much extra weight he could lose if he just spent more time crossing long parking lots. Another thing Dan underestimated was how many people wanted his $35,000. As he made his way into the gym, he passed a sea of people waiting to sign up. Up until now, Dan hadn't really thought about how much weight he wanted to lose or needed to lose. But listening to others speak, he heard claims of 50 pounds, 100 pounds. He even heard one bigger guy bet he was going to lose 200 pounds. This was Dan's first inclination that this contest may not be as easy as he had thought. While he was big, he wasn't that big. In fact, he didn't even have 200 pounds to lose. And he was right. The amount of weight that a person is able to lose can heavily depend on how much they have to lose in the first place. Individuals with a higher body fat percentage are going to have an easier time losing weight. As in Dan's situation, some individuals may have 150 pounds of fat to lose, while others barely even weigh 150 pounds. At the same time, those with higher body fat percentage are able to get into a larger caloric deficit without needing to worry about things such as metabolic damage or muscle wasting. We'll see what these are later, as some of his fellow trainees will experience them. Dan really wanted to get this bike, and he realized he was going to need to get some help with his year-long weight loss journey. Luckily, the gym had plenty of trainers available that were offering their services. To market themselves, many trainers offered guarantees such as 30 pounds your first month or 5 pounds weekly. Unfortunately, all of these trainers were all booked up first, and Dan had come too late. Then Dan saw a trainer named Antonio. He didn't offer any guarantee, but he looked fit and respectable. He was also Dan's only choice. So, as there were no other options, he signed up with him. They began to talk about how they were going to tackle this weight loss journey. The first question Dan asked was, "How much weight do you think I can lose?" "I can't guarantee you anything, as it will be up to you. However, I will tell you what you need to do. Let's not even worry about specific numbers at first. Let's just focus on what you need to do." And his trainer started to break down the plan that was going to win his bike. The first thing they went over were the best exercises to use to lose weight. Dan had heard of things like fat-melting exercises and certain routines that torch fat. What are those? I want to do those. Who wouldn't want to torch fat? Unfortunately, there will be no fat torching for Dan's 365 days of training, as there are no fat-melting exercises that he can do. This is an area where many beginners can be led down the wrong path and make mistakes. Yes, there are certain types of training that will burn a few more calories than others. However, in the grand scheme of things, these extra calories would make a very small dent in Dan's overall weight loss. He'd also be giving up the primary benefit of weight training during weight loss. Dan will learn this later. Still, he heard some other trainers telling their clients about the afterburn effect. In fact, a trainer on the other side of the gym was telling his client about it. This got Dan a little worried he may lose. His opponents were going to use exercises that cause afterburn. How can he compete with that? This is referring to EPOC, exercise post-oxygen consumption. After you quit training from intense exercise, your heart and breathing will still be elevated after a session, and your body needs to come back down to its base levels. The calories it needs to do this is termed as EPOC. Many fat loss trainees will partake in things such as HIIT or intense circuit training to maximize their EPOC, as they'll keep burning calories after they train, or so they're told. Now, there's nothing wrong with these types of training and definitely have positive benefits, but EPOC isn't one. Now, EPOC does exist, but it only burns an extra 6 to 15% of calories. In practice, this only equates to around 30 to 50 extra calories per session. This means it can mean an extra 100 to 250 calories per week or 400 to 1,000 a month. It's great that it occurs, but it shouldn't dictate your choice of training. Still, as we're speaking of fat loss trainees, many of them simply don't have the fitness levels to effectively complete this type of training. The good thing is there's a better weapon that Antonio has in store for Dan, a secret weapon to maximize his fat loss. "So what are we going to do then?" Dan asked. "We're going to focus on using exercises that are effective at maintaining muscle mass, big compound movements that use multiple muscle groups, squats, pull-ups, rows, deadlifts. These will make up the bulk of your training. These will help ensure we save your muscle mass throughout the year. This is the primary goal for resistance training during weight loss. Heck, you may even build some muscle. So don't sacrifice this benefit just so you can possibly burn a few extra calories using other types of training. Plus, they will still burn a significant amount of calories as they use so much muscle mass, and you can still get a little EPOC as a little bonus." Fair enough, that makes sense. So then how are we going to lose weight? Your nutrition. Nutrition will always be the primary way you lose weight, Antonio explained. To understand how nutrition will lead to weight loss for a year, you need to understand TDE. TDE stands for Total Daily Caloric Expenditure. This is basically how many calories Dan uses every day. It's composed of 3 parts: BMR, basal metabolic rate, physical activity, and something called the thermal effect of food. BMR is the amount of calories that the body uses to support basic life function. This is how many calories Dan would need if he laid down and didn't move all day. Things like brain function, breathing, and every other process in your body requires energy. In fact, for the majority of people, this composes the largest amount of calories and accounts for 60 to 70% of your total calories. The next section is your energy expenditure and actually comprises 2 parts, both of which Dan had dealt with already. The first is physical activity from exercise, also known as exercise activity thermogenesis or EAT. There's also NEAT or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which includes all other activities that's not exercise like walking across the parking lot. The third part is the thermal effect of food or TF. It's important to keep in mind that all processes require energy, including the digestion and utilization of food. This is TF, the amount of calories that Dan would use simply by eating different amounts of food, and accounts for about 10% of your total calories. However, beginners can increase this by eating a certain type of food. This amounts to free calories, as you don't need to do anything else but eat. In fact, if there are secrets to fat loss, this is one of them. We'll go over this later to explain in more detail. It was determined that Dan's TDEE was about 3,000 calories a day. When Dan heard 3,000 calories, he thought he could easily get away by cutting that in half, 1,500 calories a day. He really wanted to win that bike. He told Antonio his plan, which he replied with a, "Yeah, that's a really bad idea, we're not going to do that." Many new trainees overestimate what they can maintain long term. Sure, Dan might be able to maintain that diet for a week or so, but a year is a very long time. Antonio explained to him that setting up unrealistic goals is one of the fastest ways to fail on a weight loss journey. This is vital for you to understand as you begin your weight loss journey. If a plan is too extreme, you will almost certainly fail. How many times have you seen a person go on an extreme diet but only stick to it a month or two? Maybe even you have done this. As a beginner, Dan needs to understand that his excess fat is just the symptom of the real problem. You may be able to fix the symptom of excess weight for a little bit, but unless he fixes the cause, he'll gain it back. If Dan wants to be successful, he needs to adopt an active lifestyle and follow a sensible diet. The diet you eat during weight loss doesn't need to be a special diet. You just need to eat smaller portions of foods and maybe make some swaps: whole milk to skim milk, chicken thighs to chicken breast. There's really no need to do any extreme diets. Do what you can sustain. Long-term success is the only type of success. Antonio then let Dan in on a little secret. This is why the gym made the contest span a year. You often see 30-day challenges and other quick-fix type events. The gym knew these don't work. Rather, they wanted to promote a healthy lifestyle long-term, as that's the only true fix for weight loss. Okay then, what do you think I should eat? Everyone's meal plan is going to be individualized. However, a good rule of thumb is to get into a 300 to 500 caloric deficit. This is generally much smaller than most people think they should start with. For one, it's sustainable. A 300 to 500 caloric deficit is relatively mild and allows most people to follow a diet like this for an extended period of time. Another important benefit is that a mild caloric deficit can mitigate any potential muscle wasting. When our bodies are properly fed, the body will rely on stored glycogen and fat to supply energy. However, when put into a major caloric deficit, the body can break down existing muscle to gain access to building blocks of protein, amino acids. While technically this is losing weight, it's the wrong kind of weight. During your fat loss journey, ideally all of the weight you lose comes from fat. Oh, that's because muscle burns more calories than fat. While this claim is often thrown around, it's not nearly as great as some make it seem. 1 pound of muscle burns around 5 to 10 calories per day. So if you gain 10 pounds of muscle, your body will burn an extra 50 to 100 calories per day. On the other hand, 1 pound of fat may burn about 2 calories per day. So 10 pounds of fat equates to 20 calories a day. This means you're only looking at a difference of maybe a total of 30 to 80 calories a day between losing 10 pounds of muscle and 10 pounds of fat. Now 30 to 80 calories is 30 to 80 calories. So we don't want to knock that, but it's a very small amount in the grand scheme of things. Besides, there are many other better reasons to keep muscle, such as building a great shape and keeping your body strong. While Dan was learning about his diet, he wanted to ask about any special tricks he can use to increase his caloric burn. He's no expert, but he's heard of things like intermittent fasting and low-carb diets. Do those work? They can if they are able to put you in a caloric deficit. For example, if you practice intermittent fasting, but eat a caloric surplus, you're not going to lose weight. However, for some people, intermittent fasting helps to decrease their total caloric intake simply due to only having a small window of time they can eat. If this works for you, then yes, they may help you lose weight. Is there any diet I can use to help lose more weight? Glad you asked. Yes, there is. A high-protein diet has consistently been found to support and promote weight loss. As a beginner, Dan has never really experimented with high protein. What's considered high and why does it help with weight loss? There's no specific definition of what high is, but 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight is on the lower side of high. However, plans using 1 to 1.2 grams may even promote greater weight loss. Protein promotes weight loss through several angles. For one, it will keep you feeling full longer. This is because it's harder to digest and will sit in your digestive system longer. A second great reason is it can inhibit the breakdown of muscle mass. Towards the beginning of the video, we talked about why you don't want to be in a large caloric deficit. Well, increasing your protein intake can further mitigate the risk of losing muscle mass. Having higher amounts of protein will supply a larger pool of amino acids, which your body will pull from rather than break down muscle. Remember before when we spoke about a protein's high TEF? This is perhaps the most interesting thing about protein concerning weight loss. The TEF of protein is 20 to 30%. This means that for every 100 calories that Dan eats from his body, he will burn 20 to 30 just to digest it. Dan thought, so like free calories? And in a way, he's not exactly wrong. When your meal has a greater percentage of protein, you're going to burn more calories simply by eating. For this reason, trainees are encouraged to eat a higher amount of protein and decrease their carbs to compensate. Alright, so I train hard, caloric deficit, high protein, anything else? Yep, be sure you sleep well. Simply getting adequate sleep has been found to put your body in an anabolic state and encourage the breakdown of fat while in a caloric deficit. On the contrary, those who are sleep-deprived tend to hold on to more fat as they sleep while muscle is broken down instead. Oh wait, one more thing, your secret weapon. Dan liked the sound of that. Increase your NEAT. We spoke about NEAT before, now we're going to make use of it. Too many beginners only focus on the gym for losing weight. However, that only accounts for maybe 4 to 6 hours a week. What are you doing with the rest of your time? Increasing your daily activity is one of the best tools a beginner can use to increase their overall fat loss. You've probably heard of 10,000 steps a day. This is what NEAT is. Now, there's no scientific evidence to specifically support the number 10,000. However, the idea is to get up and move more, and 10,000 steps works. Your success will depend on how you spend your time outside the gym. You will only spend about an hour in the gym, but you have 15 other waking hours. That's where the real weight loss happens. So increase your daily activity every day, no exceptions. And with that, Dan was off. He now knew what he needed to do to win his bike, and so Dan began to follow his plan, just like Antonio gave him. It was a bit challenging at first, but he stuck with it. During the first month, to be honest, Dan was getting a little frustrated as other members were losing weight at a faster rate than him. Many of them were on very low-calorie diets and exercising much more than him. He began to wonder if maybe Antonio had it wrong. After the first month, he had only lost 5 pounds, while some others had lost 10, 15, and even 20 pounds. Just as Dan was getting ready to change what he was doing, it happened. Just like Antonio said it would. He saw one of the members one night at an all-you-can-eat pizza buffet eating what looked like to be enough for 3 people. He also noticed that some of the members, who at first were very enthusiastic, started to look less happy when they came to the gym. They just looked tired, and then they stopped coming altogether. But he kept on his program, slow and steady. He parked across the parking lot to get his steps in, pushed it hard in the gym, and got his nutrition right. What he found interesting was that after about a month or two, this all started becoming second nature to him. It became a normal part of his routine so that at one point he wasn't having to try. He just did it. This must be what Antonio meant by adopting a healthy lifestyle. During this time, he saw his weight steadily dropping off. Every month, he seemed to lose 4 to 6 pounds. This continued until a year had passed, and it was time to see if his hard work paid off. As Dan got to his most recent weigh-in, he was surprised that he was the only one that showed up. It seems everyone else fell victim to the mistakes Antonio spoke about. He went to weigh himself anyways and found he lost a total of 55 pounds. Dan got his bike. More importantly, thanks to what Antonio taught him, he now knew what to do to sustain his weight loss forever. He just made sure to park his bike in the back of the parking lot. So how did this happen? You see, to burn 1 pound of fat, you must burn around 3,500 calories. If you put yourself in a daily 500 caloric deficit, this equates to around 1 pound a week. If you then sustain this for a year, you can expect to lose around 50 pounds in a year. You can then burn more or less than this depending on if you can adhere to your plan. If you start with a greater amount of fat to lose, you can use a higher deficit, which results in more weight loss. This is why beginners will be able to lose more fat during their first year, as they likely have more fat to lose. For example, those with higher body fat percentage can safely and easily use a 1,000 calorie deficit. This would result in 100 pounds in a year. Others may need to use a 300 caloric deficit, which would result in around 30 pounds or so. Therefore, you can expect to lose anywhere from 30 to 100 pounds. It's your individual factors that will dictate that. However, while some people will lose different amounts, they all occur through the same mechanisms. Increase your daily activity and control your calories. Here are the key points of sustainable weight loss in your first year of training. 1. 300 to 500 caloric deficit. 2. 0.8 to 1 grams of protein per pound of body weight. 3. Go to the gym to maintain muscle. Use your diet to control calories. 4. Increase daily activity to 10,000 steps a day. 5. Get plenty of sleep, 7 to 8 hours. And last but not least, trust the process. When it comes to marijuana as a gym goer, should you puff puff pass or puff puff and keep on puffing because it's going to help me set a new personal best? That's the question so many are thinking about. Does smoking weed help improve performance? With the acceptance of marijuana growing every day, both legally and socially, it's only inevitable that someone will wonder if it can. At the same time, we also know a bunch of people are doing it anyway, perhaps falsely believing it's not going to hurt them. Or maybe they're right. Maybe marijuana is going to help. It's been shown to be an effective aid for other issues, so why not your bicep growth? We're going to find out. A lot has changed in the past decade with marijuana and society's stance on it. With rapid legalization around the world, including inside the US, laws are changing at a blistering pace. Therefore, while these stats may not be correct for long, currently marijuana is legal in 38 states for medicinal use and is legal for recreational use in 24 states. This means that anyone of age can go buy some bread, milk, and a bag of weed anytime they want in almost half of the states in the USA. This legalization is largely in part to the fact that we know a lot more about the plant than we once did. It's now accepted that marijuana has numerous legitimate health benefits for those who partake. This is evident as it first became accepted in the medical field, largely to reduce pain. However, it's also been found to reduce eye pressure, which has made it a common treatment for those with glaucoma. Other possible medical uses include reducing nausea in chemo patients, improving loss of appetite, relaxing those with epilepsy or spastic muscles, and it can treat various neurological and mental disorders such as PTSD and Parkinson's. As of late, the sale of CBD for therapeutic purposes has grown extensively. With this increase in use, it was only a matter of time before someone decided to see what happened if they hit the bong before hitting the gym. Before we go further, let's define some terminology for different substances to help you keep things straight. The first is marijuana. Marijuana is the common term for the actual cannabis plant, a plant with psychoactive properties when ingested, usually through inhalation. These plants have hundreds of different compounds, known as cannabinoids, which are responsible for getting you high. Related to marijuana is hemp. Hemp is basically marijuana that has THC levels less than 0.3%. It's basically marijuana that doesn't get you high, but this also brings us to the next term, THC. THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol, and it's one of the 100 different compounds known as cannabinoids which are found in marijuana. It's the main psychoactive compound in marijuana that makes you high. This high occurs when it interacts with the cannabinoid receptors in the brain and the central nervous system. Another word you'll hear a lot is CBD. CBD stands for cannabidiol. It's another cannabinoid found in marijuana. Unlike THC, it does not have psychoactive elements, so it doesn't get you high. It's commonly sold in its isolated form for people who want the calming effect without the high. Even though it's just now marijuana's been regaining legality, interest in it for possible performance enhancement occurred quite a long time ago. In fact, it'll probably be a surprise to you to find out just how long researchers have actually been studying the effects of marijuana and performance. One of the oldest studies on the green stuff comes all the way back from 1975. Unfortunately, it didn't necessarily help to start building the foundation for pro-marijuana use in the world of sports. In it, the researchers tested the effects of smoking on both hand grip strength and a sub-maximal bicycle ergometer test to measure work capacity. While there was no effect on grip strength, there was a drop in work capacity. This will become a common trend. Some things aren't affected and some are. Regardless, the only positive from this study is that it didn't cause a drop in grip strength. That's probably not going to make a big hit as a sports supplement. This makes sense though. It seems pretty obvious that inhaling smoke can't be good for performing exercise for extended periods. Since that time, researchers have identified more than one mechanism for an adverse effect. This can affect your cardiorespiratory, pulmonary, or even skeletal muscle systems. Upon smoking, there's an immediate decrease in airway conductance after inhalation. This will increase airway resistance, making it harder to breathe. This generally peaks 15 minutes after use and may persist up to 60 minutes after inhalation. What's interesting is that marijuana will increase resistance even if it's not inhaled. When consumed orally, a decrease in conductance will take longer to peak at 3 hours, but it may last up to 6 hours. At the same time, marijuana can increase heart rate by 30 to 50% after smoking. Not only does this increased heart rate prevent high-intensity training, it's also one of the mechanisms behind reports of feeling anxious or panic. Apart from the physiological effects, increased anxiety and panic on their own can cause a decline in performance. In terms of your skeletal muscles, THC again has a negative effect, as it may decrease mitochondrial activity by 12 to 15%. While these numbers do come from studies on mice, it has seen some major implications for us. You see, your mitochondria is where the adenosine triphosphate is produced. Adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP, is your body's energy currency, and it's required to power every muscle contraction. When energy is needed, a phosphate group breaks off of ATP, which then releases energy to trigger muscle activity. This means that the amount of work you perform is dependent on the amount of ATP you have. If marijuana decreases your body's ability to produce ATP by 12 to 15%, this will shorten your ability to work by 12 to 15%. Another concern that athletes should have with smoking marijuana are the possible negative effects on the endocrine system, the system that controls your hormones. Testosterone is the male's primary sex hormone and strongest anabolic hormone. It also has a confusing relationship with marijuana smoking, as studies show contradicting outcomes. This includes having a negative impact, no impact, or even a few with positive impacts. For example, one surprising study showed that 21 days of intense use had no impact on the smoker's testosterone levels. The same researchers then conducted a similar study but measured luteinizing hormone levels. Your luteinizing hormone is responsible for signaling Leydig cells in your testes, which triggers the production of testosterone. Again, the intense use of marijuana showed no negative effect. Now let's look at the counterpart of testosterone, cortisol. Cortisol is your stress hormone and it's catabolic in nature. Contrary to testosterone, its presence promotes the breakdown of muscle fibers, not good for athletes. Another difference compared to testosterone, it seems as though marijuana causes an increase in cortisol when used at the levels of normal use. It doesn't need intense smoking for these negative results to occur. In fact, there even seems to be a dose response. Dose response simply means that the more marijuana you use, the greater the rise in cortisol levels. This generally suggests there is a direct mechanism which creates the relationship. Regardless, so far you have higher cortisol levels and possibly lower testosterone levels. In terms of growth hormone, marijuana use tends to also have a negative effect. This is likely due to marijuana stimulating somatostatin release, which inhibits the secretion of growth hormone. However, this tends to be an acute response rather than a permanent change from chronic use. All that's to say that, in general, smoking marijuana tends to have a negative effect on the endocrine system, especially when it comes to optimizing muscle growth. It likely lowers your anabolic hormones and increases your catabolic hormones. We should also note that this observation comes from relatively few studies, therefore we can't make any conclusive statements. In addition, while these numbers do show the endocrine system is affected, we don't know if it'll have any noticeable effects on training. Will you lose your gains if you smoke just one time? Or can you smoke as much as you want as long as it's after your workout? We don't know, but as of now, we know that marijuana will more than likely have no effect or a negative effect on your hormones. Now that we have a better understanding of some of the physiological responses to marijuana, let's go ahead and look at some actual performance studies to see what happens in the real world. Let's start with another study from way back, 1974 to be exact. This study looked at the effect marijuana had on participants with exertional angina. Exertional angina is a type of coronary artery disease which causes chest pain when the person is exerting themselves due to the heart not receiving enough blood. The study used 10 patients to compare the effects that a marijuana cigarette or a placebo had on their exercise time until reaching angina and needing to quit. While the placebo decreased exercise time until angina by 8.6%, the marijuana cigarette decreased exercise time by 48%. This means that the patients could only exercise for half of the time before they needed to quit due to angina. Remember when we mentioned the first study from 1975 that saw a decrease during submaximal cycling? Well, we found two more. These studies showed a decrease in performance when completing a Wingate test. The Wingate test uses a short burst of high-intensity cycling for 30 seconds on a cycle ergometer. It measures and compares the individual's ability to achieve and maintain anaerobic power. This measures anaerobic capacity, anaerobic fatigue, and peak anaerobic power. What's surprising is that in one of the studies, the experiment simply used marijuana users versus non-users. This means that they merely confessed to the frequent use of marijuana, anywhere from daily to 4 times a month. To be clear, they did not necessarily partake in smoking before the test. In fact, 3 of the 10 users didn't even test positive for having metabolites, such as THC, in their system. This suggests that the chronic smoking of marijuana can have a negative impact on your anaerobic performance even if you haven't smoked recently. This is an important consideration, as an athlete cannot simply say they will only smoke after training or playing, as some negative effects aren't time-dependent. However, while their anaerobic performance dropped, there was no negative effect on aerobic performance, pulmonary function, or muscular strength. Why could this be? One theory behind this, at least for the no effect on aerobic and pulmonary function, is that inhaling marijuana may affect the body differently compared to administering using another method. For example, edibles consist of eating marijuana rather than inhalation. Dabbing is a way to take marijuana by inhaling the vapor of an oil and is believed to be less damaging than breathing in the smoke. Compared to other studies that only used inhalation, this study did in fact have participants that used these alternative forms of administering. This seems to support the theory that there is in fact a difference in the body's response to marijuana dependent by method of use. But again, there needs to be more studies to make a conclusive statement. However, even though this study didn't find a negative effect on pulmonary functions, it doesn't mean other studies don't find one. One of the first studies from the 1970s recorded the negative effect that smoking marijuana had on the cardiorespiratory and pulmonary system. So did this more recent study in 2007. Well, kind of. Researchers found that smoking 1 joint has about the same effect as smoking 5 cigarettes. This isn't totally surprising, as smoking 1 joint is estimated to result in 3 to 5 times higher levels of carbon monoxide and tar deposition compared to a cigarette. This may come as a surprise to many, as marijuana is generally considered to be not as bad for you as smoking is. In reality, both contain many of the same harmful components. So much so that many respiratory symptoms of smoking cigarettes also appear in those who are chronic users of marijuana. Similar symptoms include airway mucosal injury and inflammation, cough, phlegm production, and wheezing. However, even with all these similarities, something strange happens in terms of pulmonary function in another meta-analysis. In terms of pulmonary function, this study found no evidence that increasing exposure to marijuana adversely affects pulmonary function. Again, pulmonary function refers to your lungs' ability to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide during respiration. In fact, low-level users of marijuana actually had greater pulmonary function. This association lasted up to those who smoked 1 joint every day for 7 years. Now, going above this did result in a reversal, meaning that a negative effect was found. However, 1 joint a day for 7 years is a lot, and it's very surprising that users had higher function. One of these theories suggests that the methods often used to smoke marijuana stretch the lung and increase total lung capacity. For example, smokers will usually take deep, big drags and fill up their lungs with smoke and then hold. And this study is not a fluke. In fact, other studies have looked at marijuana use and pulmonary function and have found no negative effect. Another study on performance with confusing results from smoking marijuana was done in 1986. In it, participants performed 2 tests of progressively more challenging exercises until leg failure. Initially, heart rate was increased by 26% after smoking marijuana, which also led to an increase in VO2 max. However, this difference only lasted until 80%. At maximal heart rate, the heart rate equaled during both conditions. In fact, RVE, VO2, and VCO2, the volume of exhaled carbon dioxide, were the same at maximal exertion in both conditions. However, there was a decrease in that maximal work capacity again. What about post-workout recovery? Could smoking a joint with a shake post-workout have some benefits? Well, a pilot study examined this by having participants use CBD and perform back squats. The researchers then documented muscle damage markers, such as levels of creatine kinase. The results are interesting. On a positive note, CBD use did result in lower levels of markers suggesting a less amount of muscle damage 24 hours post-workout. That sounds great, but the effect on actual performance is not so great. CBD use resulted in a greater decrease in back squat performance. Ironically, the decrease in performance and increase in recovery are believed to be due to the same mechanism, the skeletal muscle relaxation effects of CBD. But that's just one study. Other studies also show benefits of taking marijuana after training. For example, a study from 2020 found that CBD oil can be used to reduce muscle pain from DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. DOMS is when your muscles begin to hurt 12 to 24 hours post-workout. When compared to placebo, CBD had less discomfort post-workout and then 24, 48, and 72 hours post-workout. At 96 hours post-workout, the CBD group had discomfort scores closer to pre-workout levels than placebo. This reduction in discomfort can prove valuable in improving an athlete's ability to perform repeated bouts of performance. Yet another study found that marijuana not only reduces discomfort of DOMS, but it also decreases several other markers of inflammation. One of the mechanisms for this is the interaction of marijuana with cannabinoid receptors in the hippocampus. These receptors are involved in regulating nociceptive perception and can therefore decrease pain. Further, marijuana also interacts with your cannabinoid receptor 2, found in the endocannabinoid system. This activates immunosuppression through several different mechanisms which play a role in decreasing inflammation. So perhaps smoking weed is best used post-workout with your protein shake, while hitting the bong before a deadlift probably won't lead to any new PRs. Hitting it after could result in less soreness. A more interesting use for athletes is the treatment of TBI, or traumatic brain injury. TBI is one of the fastest growing health concerns for athletes today, specifically for those who participate in contact sports. To date, most of the proposed benefits to sufferers of TBI are theoretical due to a lack of studies. For example, it's believed that the anti-inflammation properties of CBD could act as a powerful neuroprotectant. At that same time, some research has shown that CBD use may significantly reduce psychological behaviors caused by TBI. These are things such as anxiousness, aggressiveness, and depressive behaviors, but again, more studies are needed. Another area of interest is with sleep. Sleep is crucial for athletes and lifters, as they accrue more fatigue and damage than the general public. Unfortunately, most research is limited to subjective measures, meaning we only have testimony from users. Yet again, more studies are needed. The worst time to take marijuana is before your workout. The smoke can affect your respiratory systems, but it also artificially increases your heart rate. As a result, your workout capacity is limited and you'll likely fatigue sooner. While we can say there does seem to be some benefits post-workout, specifically treating DOMS, we need to remember that some of the negative effects of smoking happen to those who smoked only 4 times a month. This means that as far as timing goes, there doesn't seem to be a way to completely mitigate your risk of negative effects. However, there's probably less of an effect on performance if you smoke after training. Another variable to consider: eat your pot brownies. Again, some of the negative effects were seen merely from having THC from marijuana in your system, regardless of the method to consume. However, some of the respiratory effects did not present themselves when consumed in other manners such as eating. This makes sense, as drawing smoke into your lungs is drastically different than a pot brownie being digested by your stomach. Therefore, with what we now know, it appears that the best scenario would be mitigate negative side effects of marijuana by eating it after your workout. Also, less is better. We want to be very clear, this is merely an educated guess based on what we know. Again, our actual knowledge is still heavily lacking. With the rise in acceptance and use, there will likely be an influx of studies to help us have better understandings of its effects on performance. Of course, it would have been cool if marijuana turned out to be the next miracle drug, the next creatine, if you will. However, it doesn't seem to be so at all. So if you don't already partake, you definitely shouldn't rush out to your closest head shop in hopes of setting a new personal best. If you do, know it's not doing you any favors, and it's likely even hurting you. However, it is a bit encouraging to see that it's not as bad as some have made it out to be. Assuming you follow what we recommend, you can help alleviate any bad effects that might present itself. With that said, if you have a choice between a protein shake and a joint, always choose the protein shake.